let's go live in 3, 2, 1. Let's see if we're live. Hello, everyone, lovely people. I am here with Only Dog on the left, but amazingly, he does not bark. He speaks English. It's shocking. Um, so,
Australian, so let's not go too far.
yeah, that might be a bit generous. Speak the Queen's English, God damn it. I mean, she
I
is your
speak
guys' head of
quite
state too.
broad Australian.
Oh, well, that's nice though. It's exotic, you know. Well, that's probably not a nice thing to say. Goodness. I mean, it's fine. I've been called exotic, so I get to do that maybe. I don't know. I'm reclaiming the word exotic, let's say, euphemistically, let's say. But yes,
I will go with exotic. That is absolutely fine.
superlative. So, Only Dog, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do um to my audience?
Wonderful. Yeah, so I have a little YouTube channel called Only Dog on the Left. The name, I cannot remember how I came up with, but it has uh, had quite the little controversy in the last week where Radical Reviewer posted something and said, "Oh, I'm the only dog on the left as well," and there was some
Ooh.
slight beef in very good nature in the comments. I'm a high school teacher, so I live in Australia. I live in Queensland in a regional town. Yeah, this is my 10th year as a high school teacher. I teach modern history and film and television. Um, and obviously, within modern history, regarding today's topic, we have the potential to cover some controversial issues
Oh,
that
true.
touch on people's.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that touch on kids' values um, and ideologies and their ontological frameworks. And so, yeah, it's been a little bit of an interesting journey coming to how to approach that. I would say professionally and ethically.
Yes. So with regards to modern history, what sort of specific subjects within modern history have you been teaching?
Um, so with so we've got a new syllabus in Queensland, and it's actually quite good, I would say. And so over the year 11 and year 12, you choose 8 different topics. And so what I've been focusing on is the Australian Frontier Wars, which in itself is uh, historically controversial. Um, we look at the French Revolution, uh, Indian independence movement. We look at women's rights struggles, workers' rights, and then USSR, um, Nazi Germany, but focusing on the national experiences of people living in those countries,
Mm.
and then on to more. We look at Australia and Vietnam, and kind of Australia and the Asian region, essentially.
That is insane. I'm so I did like history in high school, and we never had anything that broad. Goodness, we just did. What did we do? We did I think World War I, and we did the whole stereotypical keep calm and carry on. Britain was so great
Yeah.
during World War II. And we did, to be fair, we did the American Civil Rights stuff, which was very good and worth doing, and we did the USSR, just those 3 topics. But oh my God, I wish I could have done like things like workers' rights and the founding of the modern world, because I did see. Oh, and I should clarify for the people watching. On the screen, I'm going to be putting colors on historical texts, but don't pay attention to that. That's just a pretty thing to have in the background. Um, and I've been told that it's soothing to watch the colors go up as people talk. So, so, but like, yeah, as much as I love this kind of stuff, like I'm putting colors on right now, it's frankly not important. Like, I love medieval literature, but it's so far removed from what has impacted present day societies that I just don't think it's that important. And I probably would rather that we teach only modern history and be able, therefore, to teach a larger amount of things when we do modern history, as opposed to
Mm.
three topics, which, granted, you do a good amount of detail, but still, it leaves a lot out.
Yeah, and there's a big cultural, uh, yeah, I would suppose, big culture war, thing in Australia at the moment, um, regarding the new national curriculum draft, with, politicians on the right calling it neo-Marxist, you know, shit, essentially. We have a real bad media concentration problem in Australia, where the Murdoch media has just so much power.
Mm.
And so in the state that I live, the only print news is owned by Murdoch. And uh, he has the ability to just shift the narrative wherever he wants. And then his Sky News, um, which he's going to rebrand literally as Fox News. Um,
Oh, really?
yeah,
Shit. You get to do like.
because it's
Oh, go on, sorry.
yeah, it's no, it's he's just had that much of an influence, and so much of that American culture war stuff has bled in, um, and that's with that whole Australia under lock and key thing, Um, we've had people at these anti-vax rallies holding up signs talking about this is against the Constitution, Section 14 of the Constitution, like in Australia, not realizing that they're referencing the American Constitution. It is just wild. And so, yeah, his whole thing, he's helping to peddle this. Oh, they're teaching the. It's basically, yeah, the wokes have gotten into the national curriculum, and we're not learning the facts and figures and things like that in history. That's
Mm.
really the only thing that they're concerned about.
Oh,
One is,
really? Huh.
yeah, the other thing is, they've moved timetables from year three to year two, or the other way around for maths, and then the rest of their concern is history, because we have a much broader look at history. We have an inquiry approach, and the old fossils go, no, you just need to learn the dates and the facts, and there shouldn't be any source analysis at all. So, demonstrating that they absolutely 100% don't understand the field of history.
Yes, like one of
Sorry,
the.
there's my little rant.
No, no, rant away. It's useful context as well. I mean, the whole like postmodern neo whatever. It's one of these really painful things that when somebody is like using a word and it clearly means absolutely nothing. Like
No, no.
it was like, but like I learned so much actually from on that topic from like the Jordan Peterson debate with Slavoj Žižek when Žižek just asked Peterson, "Who are these postmodern neo Marxists?
Yeah,
Can you give me a name?" And
yeah.
so many times I ask like because I get questions all the time about history and such, and they ask me, oh,
Mm,
what about these postmodern things that are ruining? And I just ask them, okay, where did you get this idea about the postmodern neo-Marxists ruining things? Can you give me an example of something
yeah.
they've ruined? And so many people are like, I don't have an example, I don't know what it is, and they were really angry about this. And I was like, okay, where did you get it
Yeah,
from? And they're like, oh, some YouTuber. um
yeah.
and it's but that to have that on the level of politicians is stark, I
It,
guess.
yeah. And I am trying to do a video about, we had this right wing politician called Mark Latham,
Hmm.
um, who used to be he was the leader of the Labor Party, which is also our centre left party, and he ran in 2004, and he was potentially going to be the prime minister, and he's since losing taken this huge right wing turn. He was on Sky News as a talking head. He got booted from that. He just keeps getting booted from all these things until he fell into. I don't know if you've heard of Pauline Hanson.
No, sorry.
She in the 90s, her maiden speech in Parliament, she talked about Australia being swamped by Asians.
Mm.
Um, and then when she came back in the 2010s, it was Australians being swamped by Muslims. She wore a niqab into Parliament and tore it off as, like a Scooby Doo villain. Just all sorts of, oh yeah, like t- terrible, terrible shit. And so she's got a party called One Nation. And now Mark Latham is the leader of One Nation in the New South Wales Senate.
Mm.
And so he is on this huge tear about gender fluidity, is his catch call of the day,
Mm.
and trying to introduce bills about, the parents should have final say of what their children are being taught in school, and no gender fluidity, getting rid of any mention of um, transness, that teachers shouldn't be talking to kids about being trans. It's just a huge,
Mm.
if it was 20 years ago, he would have been talking about gay people. If it was 60 years ago, he would have been talking about black people. If, 100 years ago, he would have been complaining about women. Just,
Yes, no, 200%. I mean, like, I have sort of mixed feelings on, well, a lot of things like this, and there is an issue, I think, not just with trans people, but with gay issues as well, where, like, because people are more likely to have heard about a trans or a gay person, well, less so maybe for a gay person, before having met one, what is said about us really matters, and it can really influence how we get treated in the world. And a teacher who, frankly, has memorized a few talking points from a curriculum, it can maybe like make some kind of mistakes in terms of how they present issues, which might lead students in either wrong directions or just to be a bit confused about the matter. But that being said, having something as like trans and gay people exist, chill out, it's not that big a deal,
yeah,
is important and very necessary. Um, yeah, to be sure. It, I am sorry, I suppose, that your country's going through all of this huge, like, I guess, anti-intellectual thing, and the matter of saying the parents should be the only ones who get to decide it. I think it's like it's evil, but it's like evil genius kind of rhetoric, because
mm,
I have this theory of politics that the simpler argument will always win. Like the argument that requires the average person to learn the least, unfortunately,
yeah,
will win out, and that tells everyone in the country, you're smarter than all of your kids' teachers, which is very flattering, really. Um,
yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting take. One of the things that I say quite often, because I've also taught English,
mm,
and when we get to persuasion, and and also in history when we're looking at persuasive devices and things like emotive language. And I always say people that are trying to give you the simplest idea are either trying to sell you something or get you to vote for them, which is basically selling you something as well.
mm.
And that's a perfect encapsulation how you've just put it. The simplest answer in politics is going to win. That's quite depressing.
Yeah, like I actually for the first time, so I teach undergrads, and I taught the undergraduate module in critical theory um this semester, and obviously critical
Mm,
theory is, yeah, hugely charged and hugely political. It was really interesting, and one of the things I emphasized the most to them at the very beginning of this course was that to be really skeptical of any kind of rhetorical claim that either flatters you, frankly, or which discourages you from thinking more about this. And, because I guess, well, I got into a lot of controversy over how I taught queer and trans theory on this module. And
yeah.
yeah, and we can get into that. I'm like a very unorthodox tran, let's say. Yes. um, and what is it? And there is a lot of stuff that the left does with that regard in regards to trans people. One of them, for instance, and I have to be extremely cautious in how I phrase this, but the framing of a gender or sex dysphoria as this innate, often biologically caused phenomenon, which is intractable to attempts to change it. That is quite a firm dogma within leftist discourse online and theory. But I mean, it's with a lot of things with trans people, we just don't have data or evidence either way for these things.
Mm.
And that's one of those claims where there's not great evidence for it. And the case of detransitioners shows that, at least in some cases, that certainly is not the case. Some detransitioners report no longer feeling dealing with sex dysphoria. With male detransitions, which are the ones who I'm more familiar with, curiously, there's a connection with mushrooms. They have a mushroom trip, and suddenly,
Really?
yeah, I know, right?
Is it
Fascinating.
the mushrooms or is it the associated Joe Rogan interest?
Yes. If you transition from a trans woman to Joe Rogan, oh god. They go, wow, that's really interesting.
Jamie, pull that up. Oh goodness.
Yes. Oh god. If I
Um,
were to detransition there and like properly like remasculinize, I would want to do like not Joe Rogan, I want to be Alex Jones. I want to be like the left wing Alexa Jones, you know? I could have so much fun
yep.
with it.
Oh goodness.
Because I
Just on Alex Jones, we've got this right wing politician who he's just quit the Liberal Party, who is our essentially Conservative Party, and he's now the head of. So we've got this billionaire in Australia called Clive Palmer,
mm,
who has the United Australia Party, and basically is just a wrecker, and he feeds all of his preferences. So we have preferential voting,
mm,
and he feeds all of his preferences to the leading right wing party. Um, at our last election, which Labor lost, they're on track to win. Labor spent $14 million in advertising. The Liberal National Coalition spent 13 million, and Clive Palmer spent over 80 million. And he's on track again to spend over 80 million, if not over 100 million. And his whole thing is now anti-vax, anti-mandate, anti-etc.
mm.
And so this Craig Kelly guy is now the head of his party, and he just the other day went on Alex Jones.
Sorry.
So
Sorry.
and it's the most bizarre thing.
I know
But
it's I know it's horrible.
I would posit that 95% of Australians have no idea who Alex Jones is. So I don't think it's going to work the way they think it will. Like the the far right American Republican playbook. I think it's just going to fall quite flat for them in Australia. But
I don't know if it will. I mean, because frankly, I think Republican or just right wing politics is much more effectively impactful than left wing politics. It's this whole thing of like, frankly, the fascist argument of, oh my god, the SJW Muslims are coming to brown your kids, like,
yeah,
um, that
and
that
impose Sharia communism.
yes, yes, yes. Absolutely. You will wear the maid outfit under Sharia
Mm,
communism. But like, that evoking the fear in, frankly, the bigots. But it's not just bigots, I think, because all of us, I think, internalize some degree of transphobia, queerphobia, racism by being immersed in a society which has it as background radiation. And playing to those fears is more instantaneously and broadly effective than an argument, a leftist coming in. It's like the ContraPoints video and going, actually, according to the economic analysis by the so and so, this
yeah.
wouldn't work. No one gives a shit, nerd. And on the left, I think there's a couple of things that I think we could do better to bring up that affect. And I think if you look at what is popular within online discourse in terms of content on the left, that gives you a good indication of this. Like debate bros like Vosh and Zanderhall, they're popular, I think, in large part because the debate actually gets that affect across. Vosh and Zanderhall, when they're debating, they're not going out there and saying, I'm actually, according to this economic analysis, even if they do that sometimes, what it's more so about is this pointing the finger, it's the blood sports, but that is affective and
Mm,
emotive, and that's more dramatic, and that gets across to people. And but the problem is, I suppose, that in education and teaching, we ideally are trying to get away from that, right? We would hope that we're trying to,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I know that so Australia is obviously heavily influenced by um, the UK, and from our education system to our culture, um, and this Americanization, because we have now got, vaccination mandates for, teachers have just rolled out, by the start of school next year, you have to have had your second jab.
Mm.
And, there are lots of, there's a lot of anxiety about this, not just due to, social media, but I have been saying to people 20 years ago, I don't think we would have had this outpouring because we were a lot more culturally British and European. Whereas now, 20 years later, 20 more years of, Sky News and all of this kind of culture war stuff that we're getting
Mm.
through social media as well, where, people are talking about individual liberty and freedom, which have never been cornerstones of Australian culture or political culture. It's always been, the kind of do what's good for society, and now it's just this hyper individualism that's come out of, I would say, left field, but and where all of those really emotive arguments, instead of talking about, how the policies are going to help you, it's these people are going to come in and they want to throw you in prison and be fascist states, and it's a lot more effective, I got to say.
Yeah, and as much as it's a weird national stereotype of us Brits being proper, let's say, and less emotive, I
Mm.
think that has a consequence of making our politics vastly more boring than American or
Yeah,
Australian. Yeah, and we have nothing like somebody going on Alex Jones. Our debates are dull as hell, and
yep,
I've heard views either way on this as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. I'm not fully sure what I think about it, but and it probably is a bad thing. Sorry, a good thing that our debates are more like rational. Maybe it puts people in a more rational mind when going to polls. And maybe they think polling is something that I is more of a refined activity that you not a refined in a sort of class sense, but refined in the sense that I do it when I'm thinking through things in a calm manner, as opposed to I'm going to go to vote to show the libs or whatever else people
yeah,
might
yeah.
thinking. Yeah, so to go back to teaching you and you were teaching history, have you had any, so you've been teaching some difficult history. Have you had any difficulties with your students on that front?
Um, so the only time I've ever had any sort of uh, pushback from a student was my very first day of teaching 10 years ago, and I had a year eight, and so back then year eight was the first year of high school. They've now changed that, so it's year seven. Um, so it was a year eight student, and we were, doing the broad intro to history because it's relatively chronological up until senior, where then you get to choose ancient or modern. Um, and so we were going through, evolution and et cetera, et cetera. And this girl put her hand up and went, revolution is a lie. And I went, do you mean evolution? She
Oh
went, oh,
no.
yeah, that's a lie. I just went, oh. I went, okay. And I went to see my head of department afterwards, and I explained to her what happened. She went, no, we're a public school. We teach evolution. And
Hmm.
that was the only time I've ever had any sort of doubt or concern about the content that I teach. And it turned out that this girl was, from a Christian background and just had at some point watched some documentary that told her that that was a lie, and but it never came up again.
Hmm. I mean, I've had similar issues. I had one student who, this is shocking, like frankly, that the whole point of the task was here's a section of Marx, here's a section of some critical race theory, and you read through
Mm,
it and you tell us in your own words what the text is saying. It's a basic comprehension
yeah,
exercise. Um, she was very right wing, so their like approach to this was to try to summarize the excerpt on the exam for the first bit, and then for the other half of the word count, they would rant against Marx or whoever else. Yeah, not very well. And I was told
Not
later that
meeting the criteria at all.
yeah, and shockingly they failed their
Hmm.
their assignments. Yes, and they actually wrote into the my boss essentially claiming that they'd been marked down because of being politically incorrect.
Oh,
Yeah, it was very interesting.
God.
Yes. Funny enough,
I would
I've
say probably the other thing that's just come up, just popped on my head is because we look at women's rights movements, and I preface that at the start of the 2 years and say, and we're going to look at feminism and and it will always be a girl, about 15, and it's always a girl that will say, "Oh yeah, I don't agree with the feminists," or "I don't agree." Like I think they've just gone too far. And I go, "Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean?" And they can never, explain what they mean by that. And then, by the end of it, they go, "Oh, yeah." And the biggest thing when we start, I sit everyone down. I'm like, "Let's talk about, gendered stuff." What always comes up is lack of pockets on clothing, and they get so angry by that. And then from there, it's very easy to lead into a lot of other, systemic issues from pockets on clothes.
that is yeah, that is nice. I do find that bringing in one hook can really link it into stuff. I taught my theory classes in a very terminally online manner. Like at one point, I literally
Mm.
trained them to be bread tubers. I sat them down, I showed them a PragerU video, and I was like, "Let's pick this apart." Dissect it. But they really enjoyed it. They had a good time doing that.
Mm.
Because funny enough, with the gender, I mean, that's what I've been in trouble for with my university, and it's a really controversial area, and I have like unorthodox views in it. And there's this, it's frankly the issue of like, I'm sympathetic to certain gender critical ideas, and I think they're important to teach within the context of queer and trans theory. In part because
Mm.
they complement queer and trans theory. And but I caveated to my students when I presented this, like I'm saying that these ideas, which normally you're encouraged to just completely ignore and not pay any attention to, some of them are good, but be very careful because probably 90% of the academic writing in this field is incredibly transphobic and vitriolic. Be careful.
Mm.
And in one of the assignments where students could like essentially give feedback and say what they wanted to, a student said that they felt well, also they didn't say that. They implied that they felt that they couldn't speak up in class, and I got a couple of hints during the queer and trans issues that they may have certain gender critical leanings. And but the thing is, from other things that they said, they're clearly like getting their ideas from gender critical sources that are more transphobic than I would like. I mean, I don't know transphobia is okay, but like but essentially that they're getting their gender critical ideas from rather transphobic sources, as opposed to what I recommended in class, which is Kathleen Stock's book, Material Girls, which is incredibly controversial, but I think is very good philosophy and trans theory. Frankly, I think she understands trans
Mm.
people better than most trans theorists. But that aside, it was it was an interesting reflection on, I guess, because with that student, but a couple of others as well, actually, who had more conservative leanings, they sort of reported being afraid of other of their peers judging them as bigots in particular. If they would openly express their
Mm.
views, yeah, because you're in a class and you're discussing these things together, and these are the same people that they're going to be on the football team with or whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much any teacher can do, to still encourage that kind of open discourse within a class, which I think could be really valuable.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do is talk about ideology. So we obviously talk about ideology a lot in Modern History. Um, and then I always try and take it back a step to ontology,
Mm.
and look at people's understanding in their own heads of what they think reality is and what they think the world is and how they think it works. And I say that always informs people's ideologies. And so you can be talking at cross purposes essentially to someone and never seeming to understand why you can't come to some sort of agreement. and it's because you're starting from fundamentally different places. So I
Mm,
think that takes the heat out of it a little bit. But just with the few things that you've said, like we don't teach anything as controversial, you know.
mm,
I mean, one of the controversial pieces that I gave them, one of the sources was from about the French Revolution, and it's from Slavoj Žižek, and
ah,
he's basically arguing that the left needs to, rather than run away from the specter of the terror, embrace it and say yes, this is what we're about, and we'll kill everyone, in the very Slavoj Žižek way. Um, and I was a little bit concerned, and when I gave them that source, but yeah, nothing came of it, and they all went, "Oh, that's posits some interesting ideas."
I'm
But
surprised that you didn't
yeah,
have.
I,
Yeah, go on.
yeah, I don't know how I would approach these contemporary controversial issues. That seems really, really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I should caveat that and that's part of why it was controversial, is that we have a degree of like leeway in with just like cut out for a second. There's nothing I can do about that. I'm really sorry. Um, but yeah, so like so on our course teaching critical theory, we have freedom. We have the freedom to to teach what we want essentially. And so I included so Kathleen Stock's ideas in the book, which is what the controversy is over, because she's
Hmm.
very controversial in general. I think, frankly, incredibly unfairly. I don't think anyone who has actually read her book can feasibly accuse her of transphobia, because she's very interested in curtailing transphobia, like
Hmm.
not explicitly actually, but implicitly. It's anyway. I should do a separate video on Kathleen Stock because she's been very much maligned. But my definitions of key terms differed from what I was taught to include, in ways that are influenced and inflected by Kathleen Stock's teachings, because I think it's important. Um, 1 second, can you guys hear me again? Because, for instance, she says that cisgender people are those who allegedly identify with the sex role assigned to them as birth. And I use this definition because I think it's more useful because, for instance, there are many populations, such as butch lesbians, who would be classified as cisgender, but who very much reject the gender norms most of them are assigned at birth. And so how do they
Hmm.
fit into into definition? And also in the lecture I was told, the lecturer said for queer and trans theory that we don't use the term transsexual anymore, and I was like, well, wait, some of us do. I do, and I
Yeah.
think it's useful. So but I use that as a way of teaching. It's like, I identify as transsexual and transgender. Let's explore like what that means and what it means for somebody perhaps to identify as transgender who isn't also a transsexual. And that was very yeah, that was very not good. I basically have burned a professional bridge over that, which was quite
Yeah.
sad. Yeah. And it was the kind of thing where like it was almost like these ideas we don't want in the classroom. So please don't bring them
Why?
in.
Why do you think that is?
Like, so I've thought about it a lot. And funnily enough, it's visible on my channel. Like when I did my political streams, and I would talk about the political stuff that's on my mind, because medieval stuff and like gender, sexuality, theory, and discourses are my two main obsessions, and so it really matters to me. And I'm trans myself, and I sort of essentially one summer holiday, before I started teaching critical theory, I picked up gender critical books and I started reading them, and I had lots of discussions with gender critical feminists who were genuinely not transphobic, and that's a key distinction that I hammer on.
Hmm.
And that's meeting people who espouse these ideas, for instance, that single sex spaces should be maintained in public, who genuinely weren't transphobic, and you can tell from how they talk about it and how they talk to me. That made me emotionally much more open, and then I was starting to look at the arguments, being like, oh yeah, those arguments that before I had not either not wanted to read or I'd written off, they make a lot more sense now. And then when I read Kathleen Stock's book, Material Girls: Why Reality Matters for Feminism, that was for me like a real eye opener. It's just so lucid and well written. There's a couple of tiny points I disagree on in terms of style, but one thing that again made me as a trans person really take to it is that Stock goes out of her way to call out the people, quote unquote, on her side, like the radical feminists who are saying things that she agrees with in certain principle, like about public spaces, some sex segregated public spaces still being beneficial. But Kathleen Stock explicitly goes out of her way to say that these people are saying these things. I agree with them on this matter, but they are including with it a bunch of transphobia that we don't need, and it's not good.
Mm.
Like they shouldn't say this. And seeing her do that, which she's actually gotten a lot of flack from radical feminists. If you look at her book on book reads, there's loads of radicals essentially going, "Why doesn't she hate the trans? I'm so mad. I'm disappointed." It's really funny. Yeah, it's great, and but that's really positive as a new way of going forward with these ideas. But I think part of it is that, frankly, the lecturer for queer and trans theories, and just like other trans people who I've talked to, struggle to open up to these ideas. And frankly, with me, when I did it, I suffered a mental breakdown, and it was visible in my channel. It was really difficult to deal with like a huge shift in how you identify and how you see yourself.
Yeah.
And I had to, for me, it was almost a matter of I couldn't ignore when I saw a convincing argument and convincing evidence. But I've talked to a lot of trans people, and they're like, "Why don't you? Why don't you just decide that it's wrong, flat out, regardless of what evidence or what arguments they have, and just say that they're all bigots?" Because
Mm.
that's what I do. And I think that having experienced the mental breakdown from not doing that, I think a lot of it is about safeguarding mental health. And I actually had a student transfer out of my class specifically because they felt uncomfortable with the fact that I was endorsing Kathleen Stock's book and that I was teaching her ideas. And this student themselves is non-binary, and they left in the middle of a lesson. They were quite obviously distressed by this subject. So yeah, it's interesting, and I feel very conflicted as a teacher who I do a lot to I do a lot to try and make my class a safe space for trans and non-binary students
Mm.
because I literally am trans myself, right? Like we do the whole, what are your pronouns thing. Um, I won't remember your name, but I'll try my best. Not that I'm going to be, yeah, 75 students. It's nearly impossible.
Yeah, I'm terrible with names of students as well. It takes me a solid 6 months.
Yeah, and then by then you onto a new batch, aren't you? I mean, you may not be as a high school teacher. Um,
Yeah, close to it though.
okay, right. Um,
That's
yeah.
I was going to say, coming in, I suppose that when you were talking about, controversial issues
Hmm.
and mentioned what it was about, I was thinking it was going to be mostly cis kids or cis students that were having a problem with what you were teaching. But it's so interesting to hear that the majority have been trans or non-binary and
Yeah.
have
Mm. Oh, go on, sorry.
is there a large proportion I wonder, is there a large proportion because of the topic that you teach, a larger proportion of trans people that do take that subject?
Oh no, it's a compulsory module, the critical theory module. Um,
Oh, right.
yeah. Um, it would be really interesting though to see what kind of students voluntarily took up queer and trans theory. At the start of the class, we had this student who seemed to be one of these theory leftists, but they
Yep.
didn't. They stopped coming, which is interesting. I wonder if maybe they dropped out for a semester or something. And I was hoping there would be more of those people because it would be very interesting. Maybe if we had a tanky or something. I don't know. Um, but yeah, no, for the critical theory module that I taught, everyone had to take it. And an interesting thing also with regards to which kind of students complain, I was talking about this with somebody and I mentioned that student, and they assumed it was a male student who walked out with
Mm.
almost this like male entitlement thing going on, which is an interesting assumption, I should say, to make. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot that I'm realizing that, I guess it's kind of human to generalize and stereotype, even if we're trying to do it in a benevolent manner.
Mm.
Where I've recently kind of gone, oh, have I been guilty of kind of the same thing that I'm thinking that other people are bad for doing? But just back to the gender critical stuff, I
Sure.
guess, with the detransitioning and things like that, that's going to happen, isn't it? I mean, statistically, you are going to have in groups people who change or feel differently in 10 years' time or want to detransition. That seems not very controversial.
Um. Oh well, that's not um really the crux of what I'm getting at, and it's not what Kathleen Stock gets at either. The whole thing, my argument isn't, as say Kira Bell tries to do, that some people detransition, therefore nobody should transition in the first place. That's not at all my argument, because I'm not. I mean,
Mm,
some trans people consider me detrans because I'm disidentified. Like I no longer call myself a woman, trans or otherwise, except in the sense of like I get perceived as a trans woman. So to some degree, I still perform that social role because rhetorically, I don't want to play into the idea which has harmed me. This idea that manhood is in any way like intrinsically associated with masculinity, because that idea has personally harmed me a lot as a kid, as a transsexual, now a transsexual adult. And the other thing is that I do believe that sex segregated spaces perform some valuable social functions and should be maintained. So the argument is not the argument of bringing gender critical ideas in is to defend those two principles. The idea of literally all gender is harmful and we shouldn't recognize it, and also that there are trends which can best be accounted for by a sex-based analysis, an analysis, a social analysis which takes account of the sex classes that people belong to, and
mm,
that there are some issues which get obfuscated by this. None of this is to say that people should transition or not transition. I do have critiques of trans medicine. It's a really complicated like matter, but my I'm not, I should say, concerned with getting rid of trans medicine. I don't want to. I still use it, and that's why like because some trans people consider me detrans because I don't call myself a woman anymore. Some
yeah.
detrans people don't consider me detrans because I still take hormones and I'm going to get surgery and such. So I'm sort of in this interesting middle ground between TERFs and trans people. It's
Mm.
weird. It's weird, and I'm
No,
hated by
that's
both.
and
No, I'm not.
I feel like it's nuance though, and that's a perfectly acceptable and something that should be encouraged is not finding yourself fitting into a certain group
Hmm.
and being able to yeah. That's so interesting. And how long has it been since you uh had that summer where you read that book?
Well, so it was looking back, it's like actually quite a it's been a slow process over like the last year of like having lots of different discussions with gender critical radical feminists and gradually changing my mind. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I had a big watershed moment when I met some who I could tell were genuinely not transphobic, and that changed my
Yeah.
whole view on everything. Because the narrative that you hear as a trans person is they want us dead, which I think is even for somebody like Janice Raymond is a bit over dramatic. I don't think she exactly wants us in camps and shots. She just wants us not to be able to transition and doesn't care if we end up committing suicide from a lack of access to cross-sex medicalization. So
Yeah.
you can accuse the Janice Raymonds of the world of terrible callousness and hatred, which I do think they have, but I don't think they advocate for violent, or at least graphically violent, I should say, approaches to, as Janice Raymond puts it, eliminating the problem of transsexualism. Oh yeah. So it's nuance. I think a lot of people don't want that nuance, and I realized when I was reflecting on why that student left my class is that I'm essentially asking, out of this commitment to this debate bro esque um, the ideas really matter kind of thing. I'm essentially asking my students, deal with this idea, which was so detrimental to my sense of self and being that I had a mental breakdown. I'm now in therapy and I had to go through things. Um, I think it was worth it. I think I'm mentally stronger for having done so, and I think I have a better perspective on my own transition for having done so. But I'm essentially asking students in the middle of a theory class to do that. But that's part of the reason why. But
Yeah,
another part of the reason why I insist on it is because I think, like that student who was clearly getting her ideas from very transphobic gender critical sources, like these ones that claim that we're all autogynephiles or whatever. Um,
yeah,
but like, I think her or that student, or rather, if they saw me, especially as a trans tutor, going up and giving the standard narrative and not conceding anything to quote unquote their side, um, they would. It's very easy, and I see this a lot with right wing anti academic rhetoric in general. Like when people rail against critical race theory being taught in high schools, even though it's not, they call it
yeah,
brainwashing, right? And brainwashing is a really easy and powerful rhetorical tool because it's a bit like the whole thing of telling parents that homeschooling is just as good. You're flattering people's sensibilities and thinking that you know
yeah,
better than this university professor or this university tutor because what they're teaching is actually not legitimate information. It's a process of some kind of mystical sci-fi mind control, and therefore illegitimate. And it's easy, I think, for frankly TERFs or the TERF sympathetic students, if they don't see any concessions made to the other side, to view the class as brainwashing, as like we're teaching this
mm,
and no other perspective is permitted. It I think it does give this implication that there is no counter argument to the ideas being raised, which I think is poor because if that student, for instance, sees that there's no counter argument to the standard trans narrative, they have this view that perhaps their own view is completely right because people don't have an actual argument against it. They have to just shut it out, which includes the parts that are bad. So whereas Kathleen Stock looks at gender critical radical feminist writings like Sheila Jeffreys and those of Janice Raymond and says, you're right on these couple of things, and a lot of these other things are either extremely exaggerated or just hateful, etc. That process, I think, because Kathleen Stock sort of sits between although leaning more towards the gender critical feminist side, she sits between trans rights and gender critical political goals. That I think encourages people on both sides to see the weaknesses in their own perspective and to challenge them. Whereas I think, frankly, it's false hope. This idea that if we just shut out gender critical ideas from the classroom, they won't be challenged. I think that the bigger danger is that gender critical people think that all of their ideas are okay because then none of those ideas are being challenged in a classroom. Do you know what I
yeah.
mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And by not allowing them into that space, then, it's the whole argument with, pushing extreme right people off, social media and things like that. Then they retreat to only echo chambers and
Mm.
they're never going to be challenged at all.
No, exactly.
No,
And
yeah, I think making people uncomfortable in that manner, whether or not it's because their ideas are being challenged or their notion of their sense of their understanding of the ideas is being challenged, is a difficult thing. And it goes back to that whole, feeling smarter than the teacher, because what that does is it just posits a teacher as a service delivery. You're just putting knowledge into someone's head, and anybody could do that rather than, actual pedagogical tools and it being a vocation and something that is important. It's merely just a here's the knowledge, and it's what knowledge is good and what knowledge is brainwashing, and we just need to ensure that we have the good knowledge.
yeah, I think it's really easy to let people think that to make that distinct or make that conflation of knowledge and education with brainwashing people. And I think
Mm,
fostering an environment where certain ideas are completely shut out does that, and this is obviously a really careful something you have to be really careful about, because it can be a slippery slope towards saying, oh well, why don't we teach racial ideas or whatever. And this is where I think and this is likewise a big thing that Kathleen Stock talks about, is that she emphasizes that a lot of the stuff people think is malicious is actually not malicious. It's just out of either ignorance or misguided views, etc. But
Mm.
yeah, like people could well take that and say, oh, well, why don't we teach racial phrenology or whatever the hell? And part of the argument, yeah, well, part of the argument against that would be that it's a waste of time, right? Like these ideas haven't been shown to have predictive utility, and
Mm.
there is also the matter that they politically sit outside of our present scope. But I think that's part of why I think the gender critical ideas should be taught, is at least in the UK, they're very prominent and they're very influential. And I think teaching, especially this is I say especially teaching the trans and non-binary students to just shut off, block and shout a slogan like punch turfs or whatever, and not listen to those ideas. It doesn't equip them to change anyone's mind in their life. If they have a family member or a close friend who comes out with these ideas, they have no tools to properly grapple with that.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think it's better for the
That
purpose of trans rights that we expose people to these ideas. Go on. Sorry.
Absolutely. That just reminded me of one of ContraPoint's old videos.
Mm.
Um, she was talking about being at uni, and this really right wing libertarian, like ultra libertarian, came in to give a speech.
Mm.
And because none of them had ever had to um, deal with any of the arguments,
Mm.
no one could make a rebuttal to it. Even,
Mm.
and it just left them all feeling incredibly useless. And I think it's exactly that same point, that if you're never even exposed to it, you are going to be left flat-footed, and therefore the other person seemingly correct.
Like exactly, never been challenged on it. Like this is why I brought up in the beginning the example of sex dysphoria, right? This is one of these things that in mainstream trans discourse, which is what I would say, like, as a more specific alternative to trans ideology or gender ideology, which is what people say, which is, I know it's such a dumb term. Like, I just, ugh, God. I mean, frankly, I hate most people who are doing gender critical discourse in public, and right now I'm actually in a process of reaching out to them and being like, "Hey, can we talk? Like, I agree on some of these things, but we don't need to
Mm,
be transphobic." And sometimes the transphobia is literally counterproductive. Like pointing out that Tiffany Michelle Moore, which is the GameStop trans woman, looks quote unquote like a man. The whole point of gender critical theory is that we're supposed to be destroying this idea that man means a certain thing, because these ideas have harmed gender
yeah,
non-conforming people. And you're sitting here like drawing on that rhetoric because you do a cheap dunk on trans people, you pathetic child.
yeah.
Like, so I'm reaching out to lots of these channels and being like, hey, can we talk about this and maybe try and do better? Very few have responded to me. I've reached out to Peak Trans and she has not responded to me. I've reached out to Mr. Menno and he has declined to do an interview. I'm going to reach out to a couple of others and see. I'm trying my best as somebody who shares some of these ideas to do it. But what I said earlier about sex dysphoria and not questioning things, you can tell me if you've ever heard people questioning this. But have you ever heard anybody in trans discourse? I don't know how familiar you are with it or anything else, asking why people suffer from sex dysphoria or gender dysphoria.
Uh, no. So I would say that I'm not particularly well versed
Hmm.
in the discourse up front. The only thing that rings a bell for
Hmm.
is someone like Ben Shapiro, um, and the only thing is because it's a mental illness. Like that's the only part, and him pretending to empathize with trans people when really he is just being a turf.
Yeah, well, I think like the mental illness, frankly, mental illness, whether it's with trans issues or critical race theory or Marxism, it's exactly the same as that brainwashing thing, right? It's saying that
Mm,
these phenomena or these ideas are expressed based on insincere motivations, and therefore you don't have to take seriously the things that they say. When you
yeah.
write somebody off as crazy, you don't need to listen to them because they're not forming their opinions on the same generally accepted social standards by which we meet them. And this is one of the reasons Kathleen Stock very strongly argues against two kinds of ways that gender critical rhetoric does this. Both the rhetoric that, oh, this is the cringiest one, it's the autogynephilic one, like it's all a boner haze or whatever, I know. Um, she says, it's bloody clear.
Boner
And
haze.
she, oh God, don't I need to do a separate video on like I call it turf astrology. There's all sorts of shit in regards to this. Because I've once had someone unironically, and they've actually done a podcast recently on YouTube. I had someone unironically tell me that like all trans women are autogynephilic if they feel better about themselves after transition than before, because that means it's sexual pleasure, even if they don't like get aroused or want to jerk off in response to it. And yeah, and they unironically
They're
said,
telling on the. I think they're telling on themselves a bit there, right? With their preoccupation.
yeah, well, to be
Oh
fair, it's
wow.
not just them. To be fair, like I took a course in Freudian psychoanalysis in school, and it's exactly the same thing. Like, oh yeah, you have an Oedipus complex, and you want to fuck your mom, or an Electra complex, because sexual doesn't necessarily have to mean like aroused or whatever. And I'm like, well, why are you using that word
Yeah.
then? That's not what the okay. Sorry, it's very. I find it really dumb, and there's a lot of that in queer theory as well. The Freudian stuff, I really hate it. But anyway, Kathleen Stock really calls out the boner haze argument and also the mental illness one. She's like, come on, clearly trans people are not mentally ill. Otherwise, they would have difficulty and impaired functioning in other areas. This is clearly not true. And I think it's really good that
Mm.
she calls out because she's clearly taking trans people seriously. And I think she's interested in the genuine reality of our social lives in a way that no radical feminists I've ever seen is actually interested in. They're interested in creating this caricature and this scapegoat of us, which is rather unfortunate. And you can see that with people like Ben Shapiro as well. Like calling it a mental illness is just another cheap way of writing it off and not having to take trans people seriously because they don't want to include trans people in their social world. And I think that's an important step in signaling to people that you don't just want them dead is I take you
Yeah.
seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just that Ben Shapiro thing. I remember he was talking about, he was doing one of his angry rants about you don't tell kids about being trans or something. And he was talking about, his daughter, my daughter's 3, blah, 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 blah. Then
Mm.
he went, if she gets to 15 or 16 and she's still talking about it, then, we sit down and have that conversation. Just completely kicking the ball down the road with, um, what would that conversation be for Ben Shapiro? Like maybe he does realize that trans people exist and, he's not, but he just doesn't want them included in his little social world.
Oh yeah, 200%. Like there's and this is why so I um argue against what's called an affirmative only model, which is this the current model, for instance, of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which basically, and this is why there's this whole push to ban quote unquote conversion therapy, because, and that sounds like a really bigoted thing to say, but like what the reason that some people oppose that is because the definition of conversion therapy is so broad to essentially this categorize anything as conversion therapy which isn't right. You say that you have sex dysphoria, let's not think about why you have sex dysphoria, let's just get you on hormones and or let's set you on a pathway for this kind of thing, which is
Mm.
generally the framework that's promoted by the NHS and by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And I think that this isn't, I don't think this is wrong because transition doesn't help people. I'm not making the Kira Bell argument. I think that it does. Or I'm not saying it because some people regret their transition. I think that it's wrong for some people. It may not be necessary for every trans person to undergo medical transition. And it's almost like trying to fit people into a narrative rather than having a humanistic approach and saying, okay, you're experiencing sex dysphoria. Why are you experiencing this? What are your needs? And this part of the reason for this is I think it's an atavism of Stonewall's like the language and the rhetoric, which was very effective in getting people to change their minds on gay marriage. The rhetoric of "I was born this way," to take the Lady Gaga song, and it's immutable, and
Yeah.
therefore you shouldn't try and get me to change. That's very effective as rhetoric to be like, okay, well, if it's pointless to get them to change because it's innate, and that's why I think there's this focus on the pink and blue brains thing within trans discourse, even though the evidence is not there for that. I think that's very convincing as rhetoric to get people not to be a dickhead to trans people, which is a very important thing that we
Yeah.
need to get better at in the UK. Um, and but therefore it leads to people not questioning sex dysphoria when I think frankly that sex dysphoria is more complicated. Hell, even sexuality is more complicated. I don't think it's necessarily always the case that people are the same sexuality throughout their whole life, that they're born that way and it doesn't change. I don't think people should be compelled to try to change their sexuality because it doesn't matter. But these narratives are rather complicated, and I think part of the reason that we run up against political groups that care more about the inconsistencies in that when it comes to trans issues is that the consequences are more severe, right? If somebody transitions and makes medical changes to their body when it's not right for them because transition was presented as the only approach to treating sex dysphoria. And then they later sort of realized they could have changed through other ways and they could have coped with it through other ways and they therefore regret it. That there are actual consequences for getting it wrong. Whereas if somebody, I don't know, doesn't, I don't know, let's just like, in the hypothetical of like a gay person who could have married a woman and therefore gotten his
Mm.
inheritance or whatever, it's not that big a deal if you want to, you can always just go and do, you can just go and fuck, you know? Yeah. Um, but yeah, no, but
Yeah,
like,
that's and
sorry, but if it just, it's just,
sorry, you go.
if you look at a lot of trans discourse, there's a lot of things that they say sort of or encourage you not to question it. And sex dysphoria is the biggest one. They're like, they don't question why people have it. And if you look at detrans narratives, a lot of them emphasize things like internalized homophobia, internalized sexism, a response to sexual trauma are really important. And this shows that clearly, at least in some cases, sex dysphoria is not only this like innate thing that's never going to change. And therefore, we need a more nuanced approach to it. But that nuance is hard. But as a teacher, that's why I included it, because I feel it's my responsibility as a teacher to try and equip students to deal with and have those discussions. Sorry.
Yeah,
I need
absolutely.
I need to
Wow,
stop.
there's so many different things now that I want to talk about. One of the things that popped up
Hmm.
for me. So I'm yeah, not well. I'm not even particularly well versed in leftist theory discourse. So my original degree at uni was politics and international relations, and my real interest is in international relations.
Mm.
And so when you're getting into global actors and things like that, um, but what like that kind of discourse is still happening in feminism, really, isn't it? Like when you said the pink and blue brain thing,
Mm.
like the kind of uh, biological versus social construct notion of gender is still happening within, I don't know, like quote unquote third wave feminism from the 90s.
Um, I mean, I wouldn't say so. Kathleen Stock, and I know I quote her a lot because she's one of the only ones that's not transphobic, but she puts this as like um the whole gender was initially constructed by feminists in the 1970s was that gender are the cultural reactions and meanings that we associate to biological sex. Um, I don't think it's. I think only, frankly, conservatives posit that there's like significant neurological differences between men and women as a means of saying, oh, it's in our brains, therefore conjugal gender roles are natural and we're better equipped for them, etc., etc. Um, from what
Mm,
I've seen, there's not good evidence for that. Because first of all, no, if you listen to those narratives, they never really say specifically what the difference is between a male brain and a female brain.
yeah.
And I've also been told that with the studies that show, for instance, trans women having certain neural anatomy, which shows greater activity during certain kinds of activities, as visible during MRI scans or MRI scans, that actually gay men have brains more closer to the average natal woman, for instance, than trans women do. These arguments, I
Mm,
think, yeah, these arguments are quite weak and not substantiated. But again, that's one of those things that you're told trans women are women, and we have this innate essence that makes us so. And claiming that it's biological is very effective rhetoric. It's simple. It's like it's in my blood.
yeah.
It's in my genes. Don't think about it.
And it's that basic kind of understanding you might have if you did, biology in year nine. And so then you can feel smart.
Yes.
That I just wanted to pick up. You just said natal women. Is that
Yes.
something that you'd use more broadly? That kind of
So I've had
grouping?
I've had trans people like get mad at me about this, and I'm like, I learned these terms at like the trans clinic that I go to, right? So like the use of the term natal woman and natal man is just a more accurate way than saying biological woman and biological man, because natal male, natal female just means that your sex was identified by a medical doctor at birth to be male or female. And this implies, first of all, that you've received a certain kind of socialization for most of your life. There are some exceptions of trans kids who transition relatively early, but those are so rare that I don't think they should really factor into a broader, or at least they shouldn't overturn a broader social analysis. And also, it's
Mm,
going to say that you have certain biological realities. Like, if you're a natal male, you're probably going to have been born with a penis, and if you're a natal woman, a vagina, etc., etc., or a natal female, you'll have been born with a vagina, etc. Whereas, but what it doesn't do is assume certain things. So, if you say that somebody is biologically male, for instance, you might assume that they have high levels of testosterone in their blood, or that they have a penis, etc. And that's not true for a large number of trans people, so it can be misleading in terms of how you describe them. So, I mean, the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, one of the guys who runs that podcast, he says, if I have a heart attack, he's a trans man in his, goodness, 40s or something, has been transitioned for a while.
mm,
He said, if I have a heart attack, you know, am I going to have the male warning signs or the female warning signs? And having terms like, if they are described, for instance, I think it's he. If he is described, for instance, as biologically female, and he's described himself that way to his doctor, as an example, his doctor might assume the female warning signs when they need to be aware that
mm.
there's a possibility that he has the male warning signs, because he's a natal woman, but he's undergoing various cross-sex medicalization practices which change his biology. So that's why I use the term. So natal man and natal woman is basically biological man and biological woman, but just in a more accurate way.
Yeah, and I guess a more nuanced doesn't assume that it is therefore um, unchanging and imputable, you
Mm,
know, in kind of the way that conservatives might use biological
yes.
male, you know, when they're ranting about sports or something, because there's that implication there. So yeah, that's interesting. I learned something new.
And
Um,
I've had trans people like say, "Oh, that's so gross," and when I examine why, because I'm like, well, I learned this term at a trans clinic. That's how my doctor describes me because it's useful medical terminology.
mm,
Um, it comes up that it's the sex-based analysis that they disagree with. They don't like examining
yeah.
society through the lens of a sex class, and that's one of my main objections as a teacher and as an academic, because frankly, there are social trends which map onto a sex-based analysis, but not onto a gender-based analysis, and which are important. And the example I like to bring up because it's the most visceral, and also because it's I think it's quite consistent, is certain kinds of violent sexual crime. And I think violent crime in general are almost exclusively committed by natal males. Just look up serial killers, right? And female serial killers, the vast majority of them use poison to kill their victims. Very few will like
Mm,
shoot or and then after that, some of them shoot victims. Very few like bludgeon them or torture their victims, etc. Whereas natal males do. So there's clearly a trend where this group of people, which is partly defined by the biological category of natal males and natal females, there are social trends there that are important. And from the perspective of police and law enforcement, and this was a controversy in the UK recently, if a trans woman is recorded as not as specifically a natal male but a trans woman, but they are recorded simply as female and even put in female prisons, which is a whole other controversy. But if they're recorded as just a
mm,
female, that prevents sociologists getting an accurate picture of the data, because right now we can see the trend that natal males commit these crimes, but in the future when these kinds of statistics are recording gender rather than sex, we won't be able to see that data, and it could be really important data. Like frankly, like I don't know if that's the whole argument with rape shelters, right, about admitting trans women, is that there is a statistically greater risk, and from the limited studies that I've seen, trans women seem to commit these violent crimes at similar rates to natal males, or just to the average natal male population, which means that adding a trans woman to a women's rape shelter does statistically introduce an increased risk of certain kinds of violent sexual assault. Like, that's an undeniable statistical reality, and I can understand how, even if that risk is incredibly small, and this trans woman is vulnerable herself, that could make the other women in that shelter, it could impair their healing process from trauma. And what I just said about it's a statistically very small risk. Yeah, but they're not thinking in those terms. These are women who've just been traumatized almost exclusively by male-bodied people, and
Mm.
therefore having a space which is guaranteed as excluding male-bodied people could be very important and beneficial for them in the recovery process. And right now in Glasgow, there's a whole controversy about a rape shelter which is run by a trans woman, which is saying that if a female rape victim, a natal female rape victim comes in and they don't want to be in the same accommodation with a trans woman, like getting rid of that bigotry in their view is part of the healing process, which I think is a very cruel way of doing it. You're not putting the victim first here, you're putting your own political ambitions over whether a victim recovers or not. So that's just an example of one of the ways in which a sex-based analysis is important, but in which the attempt to completely remove sex as a category in sociology and humanities for social and cultural analysis is detrimental. And Kathleen Stock, by the way, is not saying that we should only analyze people according to whether they're natal males or natal females, because gender is also very significant, which is also why I think that trans lesbians can be a thing. Or trans gay people, because let's take my own sex as an example, right?
Mm.
Some actual people will be like, I don't know, Buck Angel holding hands with some cis dude and kissing in public. That's a straight couple, and therefore you shouldn't call them gay. I'm like, yeah, but do you really think people are not going to call them the F slur in a really homophobic area? Because oh, he's trans.
Yeah.
That's a good old traditional male
Yeah.
female coupling. It's ridiculous. They're clearly within the sort of they clearly experience the same stigma, which leads people to use the term gay to defend themselves. Also, I'm rambling far too much now. I'm very sorry.
No,
Yeah,
no, no, no. It's great.
there's just a lot of stuff that people don't encourage you to think about and question in more detail with this stuff, and it's hard to get that in as a teacher.
Yeah. Wow. Just yeah, when you were talking about that women's shelter
Mm.
and how, because the bigotry that they're referring to then is a sex-based analysis, isn't it? Just as a whole.
Well, let me
Healing from their bigotry.
well, so what the leader of that rape shelter said is that, yeah, she says that essentially getting rid of in those rape victims of the notion that natal males are going to be more dangerous to them than natal females is part of the healing process, which, like I've just pointed out, is factually not true. And people say that people will sometimes question these statistics, and what I would do caveat them with instead is to take literally just numbers that we can hold in our hands. If you look at the number of violent female murderers, as in who bludgeon their victims, torture them, etc. I'm fairly sure I could go to Transgender Crime UK, which is a shitty website, but they do record these crimes, and find greater numbers of that happening with trans women than with natal women.
Hmm.
So I think it's difficult to argue against that, as that the statistical reality is there, and I think it's kind of misleading to present it to people as if that's not the case. It's really complicated for why trans women don't want to, I guess, admit to these analyses. Part of it is, frankly, that, like you just said, it would involve. I'm essentially saying that trans women have a male pattern of committing crime, and that sounds like calling trans
Hmm.
women men, which is a more complicated. Again, these are very complicated discussions, but that's, I think, why there's the reticence there. But I feel that we can't let this. I guess the fact that it makes us feel better is to deny that this trend exists in the data that we currently have. We can't let that feeling override our presentation of that data, especially as teachers. I think I'm failing my students if I claim that gender violence is a trend when the statistics seem to correlate according to sex classes. Do you know what I mean? Especially in terms of who's victimized.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, no, sorry, not in terms of who's victimized,
And
who's the aggressors. Sorry. Yeah.
and also if you remove you from that, you seed all of that, because all of that, all of those statistics are going to then only be utilized by people who don't want trans people accepted into society. So
Mm.
yeah, by not acknowledging that and having difficult conversations, I suppose, and particularly in the sphere of education, is yeah, I don't think you're fulfilling whatever kind of pedagogical Hippocratic oath uh, you might be operating under. Um, I did just want to ask, do you have a time limit for this?
Sorry, no, I don't have a defined time limit. So,
Okay,
um, yeah,
cool.
if you,
Because I just have a couple more questions.
of course.
Um, I guess one's more a comment, and
Mm.
it's about, on Twitter or something in lefty spaces, you might see, oh, when do we have to stop talking about this thing? Isn't this just well-known knowledge? But, being a teacher, you see people are still growing up and people are still maturing, and people may never have interacted with all of these sorts of concepts or theories, etc., etc. And so I don't think there's ever going to be a time when, you're not having to do basic intro level stuff. I mean, obviously, university, with undergrads, you're always doing intro level stuff because
Mm.
they just might not have come across it any time in their life. And so all of these notions, I guess, yeah, it just gets pretty. Um, there's the danger of it just becoming, this is accepted knowledge, don't question it, and we'll just move on. And the discourse has moved on from that. You don't have to worry.
Yeah, I mean, the discourse has definitely moved on from certain things. Well, to some extent at least, like, should we be racist? We're not having that conversation,
Yeah.
which is, but it's why I'm very passionate about not letting the conversation be, should we be transphobic? I'm trying to have the conversation of,
Mm-hmm.
we should keep sex-based analyses in the humanities. But you're absolutely right. But one of the reasons I think it's really important is that I asked my students at the start of the queer and trans theory lesson to put their hands up if they had a friend who was trans or non-binary, or they knew anyone who was trans or non-binary. They did that. Cool. And then when we went through key terms, I was like, okay, what is transgender? What does that actually mean? They didn't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, to some degree, that's necessary and important. I think the fact that it's a general social principle that you respect the trans person's pronouns, you refer to them as man or woman, non-binary, however they want to be referred to, um,
Mm.
because those misgendering is a trigger for a lot of traumas that trans people have had, usually with having sex role expectations forced on them, or gender role expectations forced on them. Encountering those kinds of triggers can like really impair their ability to function in a class, which is why that student left my class. Presumably, they were reminded of the sort of some of the issues that they'd had going on, which had caused them a lot of pain, and it sort of literally meant that they couldn't focus in a class. So on one level, that you, as a teacher, you need to establish that as a baseline, which is aside from the fact that I think it's on principle the right thing to respect a trans person's pronouns and stuff like that. That's part of the reason why I would do it as a teacher, like regardless of what I felt about this, is that I want my students to feel to literally not be panicking during a class and to feel okay.
Mm.
Sometimes people say that, oh, well, that's an overreaction. I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter if it's a common reaction that we need to anticipate that that could be the case and accommodate our classrooms to make it better for students. But yeah, there is definitely a fine line between questioning everything, I should say, and excluding everything. There's a balance.
Yeah. Um, so back to
Hmm.
one of the main points that you raised.
Yeah.
I wonder if can you tell me why do people experience gender dysphoria?
Yeah, so I specify it as sex dysphoria because I would ask you, so what would you say the gender dysphoria is?
I guess the notion that you don't feel connected to your body.
But why? But we're
Uh,
saying that trans people, for instance, can have a male body but a female gender, right? That's the whole point of saying
mm,
trans discourse.
yeah, true. I don't know. I guess it's one of those things. I've just never.
Yeah, that's
I've just taken on face value. Yeah.
yeah, that's why I specify. That's why I say that I suffer from sex dysphoria because that's more like
Mm,
obviously identified, and not just that, but like if we take so so one could say, and I do say this, that incels suffer from sex dysphoria. So sorry, from gender dysphoria, because what are they? Incels, the male incels, are feeling inadequate within their masculinity, feeling like they're not masculine enough. Now, when trans women say that they don't feel feminine enough, we say, oh yeah, that's obviously gender dysphoria. But we don't say that when it's incels because they're feeling inadequate within the gender role they were assigned at birth. It's inadequacy when it's
yeah.
when it's the assigned gender role, and it's dysphoria when it's a not assigned gender role, which I think does a disservice and goes to further normalize the expectations of these things. Which is why I like to say that male incels suffer from gender dysphoria. Because I think, and
Yeah.
sometimes even sex dysphoria.
Is that something that's been written about? Because that's such an interesting, and as soon as you say it, it makes perfect sense.
I don't think so. No. I need to like become the sort of gender critical trans theorist and go out there and start writing this stuff. When I finish my PhD.
Yeah, that's sorry, that's super interesting. I mean, as seeing so much of that incel stuff. Wow, yeah.
Think about this.
Sorry.
Okay, no, let's take sex dysphoria as well, right? Sex dysphoria would be born in the wrong body and feel like a trans man feeling like he doesn't have a penis is a lack. Incels feel like they are
Mm,
in the wrong body. They want their chins to be longer. They want to be taller. These are bodily
yeah.
discomforts. You know, it's really interesting. Sorry, I just think this is one of the
Yeah,
reasons I
wow. That's so interesting.
yeah.
I wonder, I mean, what's the current discourse about it? I mean, I guess there's no almost no empathetic kind of discourse around incels.
Yeah, we read a paper on them for like the masculinities week of critical theory, and it's basically just looking at it from a level of incels are suffering from toxic masculinity, which is true, but there's a lot more going on than just toxic masculinity, and I think
Yeah.
yeah, um, and that's sort of like one of the things that Kathleen Stock gets at a lot in her book is that the reality of things like gender is much more complicated than either side is admitting to. And to me, that's fascinating. There's so much interesting stuff going on
Mm,
there. It's juicy.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not relegated to some long answered question.
Yeah, but in the lecture, for instance, for the professor gave, because I gave workshops accompanying the lectures, I wasn't giving lectures. In the
Yeah.
lecture, um, they touched on sex dysphoria and said people are just born this way and you can't conform to these norms because you can't change it. And I was like, well, really? There's definitely lots of people who um, change their views on sex dysphoria or develop sex dysphoria after sexual abuse, which is very common in natal female detransitioners, or who
Mm,
yeah feel an internalized sense of homophobia, which Florista, who I've done some videos with, has definitely felt that. I think she is detransitioning. Yeah, she is detransitioning. Sorry, they are detransitioning currently, and they feel like they transitioned because they couldn't get over internalized homophobia and shame over being gay. So and there's definitely a trend from what I've seen. There's little research on it in terms of statistics, but detransitioners do definitely tend to be attracted to the same sex more often than um, the general population, let's say.
yeah, wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
You should 100% go and do all of this research. In all of the spare time, I'm sure that you.
Yes, this is it. Like I'm doing a PhD not in this stuff. This is my sort of hobby. I'm doing my PhD in bloody medieval astronomy, and but I think it's one of these
Oh,
things. Like
God.
I personally, I think like I grew up as a queer kid, and part of the reason I'm so passionate about this, I grew up as a queer kid, and I was essentially told that being queer will inevitably lead to a miserable lifestyle, and regardless of whatever evidence you bring up, you can't challenge that notion. That's just like accepted truth, and we're not going to question it. So I sort of view not listening to other people's arguments, not hearing them out, even if they're very like mean people or difficult arguments to deal with. I view that as a sort of cruelty and a trauma, which maybe is irrational of me to do so, but that is where I'm coming from in this regard. But I think that when you think more when you look past the talking points on either side and you look at trans people more honestly as neither like fetishistic or gynophiles, although some people definitely are, and neither is like I guess what's supposed like destined, innate biological trans people, you get much more
Yeah.
fascinating outcomes, or like you see a much more interesting reality that can predict things better.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Is on that, I suppose. Um, is there research that's been done with regards to transitioning across different societies where gender norms and gender expectations are vastly different?
Ooh, this is my shit because what's on this stream right now is because I said at the beginning, right? My two main obsessions are history and gender sexuality theory, and they sometimes combine when I'm reading like
Mm,
an ancient Greek story about essentially a trans man living as a man. Um, and I'm like, oh my God, this is juicy. And you can dive into so much stuff about. I have a video on my channel called "The Sexual Politics of Bread in Visigothic Spain," um, as an example.
that is a an academic paper title if ever I've heard one.
Let's get this bread, boys. Um, but yeah, so you combine it, and so I see that with like the Greeks and Romans and the Vikings, who are essentially a different culture to ours, although in some ways ancestral to ours. And there's them, and there's also actually Havelock Ellis, which is granted an English doctor's book on sexual inversion, which is like the Victorian word for basically being gay and being trans, but they thought it was the same thing. So
Yeah,
he did.
right.
So I mean, we still kind of do actually. If you listen to some conservatives, they sort of say it's all some kind of gay, or they assume that trans people are gay.
Yeah, yep.
It's one of the. I mean, there's a whole other rant about why I don't think there's a group called Get the LGB Alliance, and there's like Get the L. No, the Get the L Out is different, but the LGB Alliance argues that LGBT issues are completely separate from trans issues, and I'm like, no, that is definitely not true. Just the fact that detransitioners are more likely to be gay alone, there's clearly an intersection
Yeah.
of gender and sexuality. I think because. But this is what I've heard. I mean, I'm asexual, but I've heard from my allosexual friends, both gay and straight, that a part of what matters for them when they have sex is that they feel like they're having it as a man or as a woman in the way that makes them feel affirmed in who they are. And
Mm,
so, how can we say that there's no connection with gender and sexuality? It's yeah,
yeah.
there's there's so much. It's a juicy, fascinating topic, but it's a really controversial issue of like addressing people in cultures as transgender who don't want to be called that. And that's one of, I think, the distorting factors of the narratives around transness, and likewise the narratives around gayness. Dave Halperin has, for instance, argued that the way that we do gay politics now, where we talk about homosexuality as an attraction to people of the same sex, which is innate and a persistent pattern of attraction, which is incurable, is difficult to apply to the past because people didn't have that category for one, so they didn't think of their
Yeah.
own desires in this way. And I think if we have a word for it and we think about things in a certain way, we organize ourselves accordingly, according to how we understand that word to be. Which is why I think talking about the definitions of words like man, woman, dysphoria, etc., is really important because we need to be very earnest about how we do, because whichever definition we have is going to direct our social actions and our discourse, right? Just the fact that we do, like
Mm,
I said earlier, we don't think of incels as suffering from dysphoria because we think of dysphoria as a term associated with trans people, exclusively, I should
yeah.
say. Oh, one thing that's not so it's not academic writing, but Lauren Black has written about dysphoria in lesbians but who don't transition. So that's an interest. She has some interesting papers. No, sorry, articles published, think pieces published that one can look up. That's Lauren Black for anyone in chat who wants to look her up. But there's loads of so the claim is often made by mainstream trans organizations that some form of transness exists in every culture around the world. You'll have heard this, like, oh, there's Two Spirit, there's Homeboys in Indonesia, there's the Hydras. And we were talking about this very briefly before stream. I'm extremely skeptical of this on the level that how the hell do you know what gender role the Hydra goes into? Do you even know what the pronoun he or she is in Hindi? Like, or how that you would
Yeah.
describe that? It seems really easy for somebody to claim, oh, this is how it was, and we just completely gloss over it. Like Jessie Gender, for instance. Oh God, like as a transsexual, like seeing people like Jessie Gender make the really dumb arguments about trans history is annoying because there's loads of trans history. There's a bloody trans masculine coming of age story. We've got poems about people who seem to be cross dressing. There's one in a sort of Anglo-Saxon quote unquote manuscript. And it says that this happens quite often. Like there's loads of transgressor and cross-dressing stuff. We don't need to claim that Elagabalus was a was a trans female Roman emperor. Okay, this is ridiculous. Sorry, but that's a similar thing. It's like Jessie Gender can say that because who the fuck in her audience is going to read? Well, it's not Latin; it's attested in Greek. That claim and go and read the Greek and say, oh well, actually, this. Well, even if we do accept the claim, this isn't. This is probably just made up. And oh god, sorry.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm
No, I mean, that's an interesting point about, just fitting things into your narrative. I
and
mean,
it's very colonial, isn't it, to say that we think that transness is innate and there's trans brains. So therefore, we're going to assume that there are
mm,
people in your cultures who have those brains.
yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it, actually.
And there's a big thing in Brazil. David Kulik has a fascinating book, wrote a fascinating book in 1998 on the travesti of Brazil, and they're basically me, except like sexual, in that they they modify their natal males who modify their body and modify their secondary sexual characteristics through medical interventions to better assimilate the average physiology of the opposite natal sex. So basically, they get breast implants and they have vaginoplasties performed on them, etc. But these people, even though they use female pronouns for each other and female names, they will say I am a man. They'll be like, eu sou um homem, e os meus pronomes são ela. I'm a man and my pronouns are so and so. And Kulik does, interesting enough, as a gay man, does loads of these. He does loads of interviews. He lives with the travesti in Brazil, and right now, to my knowledge, in Brazil, there's this. It's sort of they've sort of been displaced by the more Western and American discourse around transgender, which is now why on YouTube you have channels that are called
Mm,
transgênero in Portuguese or transexual, which is transgender and transsexual, and people less often saying travesti. In fact, one of the big YouTubers, Brazilian trans YouTubers, Barbici, she opens her videos like "E aí, travesti," and she got in trouble for that. Some people took issue with her for doing that because it's like that's an outdated term and it doesn't apply for us. And it gets into really interesting discourses of like who is more influential in international discourse around trans people. Is the transgender discourse in Brazil a colonial or a neo-colonial import? Um, yeah, there is so much.
yeah, no, that's I'm fascinated by that kind of cultural imperialism. Um, yeah, oh wow, so
Yeah.
much to be had there. And also just because I don't know why I saw this, but I saw something with Caitlyn Jenner. I think it was the start of she was trying to do a reality show or something, and she went on this bus trip with a bunch of older trans people
Hmm.
who were using terms that she was arguing were offensive, and they were saying, no, 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 like I took this term on, much like queer and gay
Hmm.
in the 80s. This is now my identity. Caitlin was saying, no, you can't say that word, and it was a really interesting, that same kind of, who owns the discourse essentially.
Yeah, I am completely shocked that Caitlyn Jenner would be insensitive to the plight of others.
I hope you're sitting down for that.
Yes, I'm like, oh my god, wow. Oh my god, she's a Republican, you say? No.
Yeah, what? A millionaire Republican? Those
Oh,
two
yeah.
things don't go together.
Yes. Oh, she's so bad.
Ah,
I've been hesitant to watch the Netflix documentary about her because I feel it's going to be the most cringe thing.
mm,
Oh, also,
yeah,
on an international front, did you like follow her campaign for California governor? It was so funny.
look, the only stuff that I saw that through, the only lens was Dave Rubin being upset that she wouldn't go on his program for an interview.
Oh, Jesus,
So,
man.
but I mean, how was that received by Republicans? That's what in the era of Trump kind of
Mm.
Republicans, I
Well,
don't know how that was received.
at CPAC, when there, I heard that there were people following her around, calling her like all sorts of transphobic slurs, etc. Um,
Uh,
yeah, and there's Lauren Whitaker, who I think was a candidate for the Republican Party in some local race, and there's a really interesting debate that she had with Lauren Whitaker, John Doyle, who's like another conservative Republican on YouTube, Blair White, and Karlin Borisenko, who
oh wait, I
you've
saw.
seen this, yeah.
Yep, as soon as yeah. Oh wow, that was I mean, maybe I was living in a bubble, but yeah, that was certainly eye-opening.
She's like, we have a man, woman, it, whatever. Like, I mean, she's like very obviously hateful, but I think that's a big wing of the Republican Party. Let's be real. Um,
Yeah,
I mean, not to like disclose too much of my personal trauma because it's not a traumatic issue for me. But my mother is extremely transphobic, and when she discovered that I was transitioning, was determined to become more so. And in her own words, she supported Trump because she thought he was against the trans people. And I asked her, well, what policies did Trump do? There was the military ban, but like aside from that, she didn't know about that. But I said, in some
yeah,
ways, he's also signaled pro-trans things. Like he was nice to Caitlyn Jenner and says you can use whatever bathroom at Trump
yeah.
Tower. Um, but is this almost like, and I see this also with actually the gender critical stuff. I've seen gender critical people support Kathleen Stock, and criticize other people for things that Kathleen Stock herself does. And it's like, I think people, yeah, but I think with the trans issue, people engage in the discourse. First of all, let's be real. We engage in this discourse because we're dealing with emotional trauma on both sides. TERFs have like a lot of emotional issues from dealing with like sexism and gender roles in men, and they react to trans
Mm,
people getting that. Trans people have had loads of transphobic shit, and when we get into these discussions, we're like getting mad because it's hurt us in the past. Conservatives are just disgusted by anyone who's not a cishet white man.
yep.
Yep, and they want to feel safe again. Um,
Yeah.
but this results, and I think and this is why I'm struggling to get across to students as a teacher and get them to think about, not to use the Dave Rubin line, but ideas, right? To think about the actual ideas. I hate it, but like to think about ideas and like actually rather than looking at trans discourse as like this series of symbols that people throw at each other of like the disgusting trans person or the sexual predator or the hot conservative trans lady like Blair White. Um,
Mm,
these symbols are just like very easy to click on and look at, but and I'm being very elitist in my tone even when I talk about this, but they mask a much more interesting and important reality for both trans and non-trans people that I think gets overlooked. Especially, and this is doubled when we're talking about other cultures in the world. Because let's think about, I don't know, trans people in Indonesia or Brazil or whatever. How do we talk about them? I don't have an answer to this. How do we
mm.
describe them when we don't have the language that they do? It's really difficult.
I think that kind of just bringing it back to the education
Hmm.
aspect or lens, it can be confronting to your ego as you're in a relative position of authority if you have to say, like you just said, I don't have an answer for this. And I think that can cause, I think great teachers would say that and be very open and transparent about it. I think there's the tendency, though, for some educators to act like they do have the answers for it,
Mm.
because their identity is so linked to this position of authority, or as quote unquote, an elite within society, where they have all the answers and they are smarter than everybody else. And so when things do come up that challenge, notions that they have ascribed to, um, it's very difficult. I had an atheist pair about 15 years ago, and Richard Dawkins, back before he had a Twitter, and you could say, "Oh, cool, Richard Dawkins," but he was, telling some story about whatever university he worked at, and some scientist came and gave a talk. An old professor who'd just been completely blown out of the water by this scientist went up and shook his head, said, thanks so much. I've been wrong all these years. But, that kind of, and I wonder if the humanities as a, quote unquote, softer science tends to have more party lines, battle lines drawn around different topics.
So, I mean, I think, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, I think humanities maps more onto electoral politics for the simple reason that the issues are the same. Like, if you take an honest class on, goodness, like, like sociology, and you learn about gender norms in society, you see that the feminist claims, many of them are just factually correct about women doing more of the housework, or about immigration benefiting an economy. And those are claims that frankly directly contradict what right wing parties tell. My high school sociology teacher said that, yeah, I'm left wing, so I'm biased in that regard, but also, frankly, reality has a left wing bias, to borrow that famous quote. And in some instances, you can't avoid it, which is why I think humanities are more liberal. And I think it's why, because, the critical thinking that you learn in science could lead people to left wing positions, but that doesn't matter if they never apply it. And I think we all know, right, people who are great at critical thinking in certain areas of their life and then never apply it to others. I think this happens with trans people. I think
Yeah.
it's turfs say that it's like a religion, like gender is like a religion. And I think it is for trans people. We often take it as a matter of faith and we don't question it. And that's why people questioning our gender can feel like when people like have their Christianity attacked. It's a very emotional
Yeah.
thing, which isn't to dismiss it. I'm a Christian myself. But yeah, I think we're like selective in where we apply our critical thinking, and like you say, our role as a teacher is to get students to doing that, and also we need to be reflective on ourselves and say, am I being critical enough of my own ideas where I need to be? I was curious. I was going to ask you, have you ever had a student ask you something that you were like, oh wait, I hadn't thought about it. I have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that up front, and I'll say that I don't know.
Hmm.
I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I'm sure that I have. Um, I had when a couple of years ago, one of the girls that I taught with the French Revolution assignment did an excellent essay, but she, rather than the ideological stuff that everybody else did, she looked at the financial troubles that France was going through and got secondary sources because she couldn't speak French, but she got secondary sources, but translations of like the accounts and things like that,
Mm.
and made this really compelling case that it was a really materialist analysis of the implications for either whatever, and it was just so fantastic. But she had asked me a question, and I had no idea about it. I just went, I don't know. You're gonna have to go and Google. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, mm,
Yeah, but I'm impressed by that. Wow, a high school student.
yeah, and she was year 11 too. It was like just fantastic, and it was a joy to read. Also,
Well, you must be a very good teacher to like nurture that kind of curiosity in the students.
well, yeah, I'll take that.
Take the compliment, god damn it.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
trying to butter you up. Oh goodness.
But yeah, before how you were saying about it can feel like a religion, and it can feel like we're um, you know having somebody, it's an affront to us. Just yesterday, I rewatched that H Bomber guy, War on Christmas thing, where at the end he's talking about Dennis Prager, and how Dennis Prager makes this claim that when people are not saying Merry Christmas, they know what they're doing, and kind of you know playing it, spinning it as you don't have to listen to people that are questioning you because they're doing it with ulterior motives. So
Mm.
if anything makes you feel doubtful, don't worry. You have every reason in the world to just ignore them. And this, I guess, the same thing with the trans stuff. Oh well, don't worry because they're just turfs, or they want all trans people to stop existing, or et cetera, and so we don't actually have to confront any of those pesky things that they're bringing up.
Yeah, 200%. I think like teaching can be a good way to, I guess, view that as as a lens, because I mean, this is going to be insulting, right, to say like the electorate are like children, but I think so. And it's elitist of me to think it. I'm very elitist in my thinking, but I like the Richard Dawkins analogy that like, you know, when you go to get surgery, you want an elitist surgeon, you know? But we seem
Mm.
to like selectively not want that for certain things. But yeah, it can get you to reflect on that. And with what you said about Dennis Prager, him saying that, right? It's almost like, sorry, it's almost like saying, homework is cancelled for this week, students. You don't have to do any work. You've already done
Yeah,
it, which people love, as I'm sure you'll know.
yeah,
Goodness, the joys of teaching. There are some joys. There's also some.
yeah. it's it's important to, I think, focus on, yeah, those joys. It's very, I guess. Do you ever teach? I don't know how COVID's affecting the UK, but do you teach on campus?
Yeah, so I taught last semester. I taught reading medieval literature, which is obviously much less polemical. I taught that via Zoom from England, and now I'm teaching.
Mm,
Uh, and now I'm teaching critical theory, or this semester I taught critical theory in person in university,
yeah.
which was different. I think, frankly, here's the thing: like, just as a teacher via Zoom, you like it doesn't. You have less power over them. Not, and that sounds really crazy, but what I mean is like in an in-person class, if you let the silence sit, it's awkward for them and they hate it. Whereas I think on Zoom it doesn't matter as much. They could have Facebook open for all you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you teaching on Zoom or in person?
In person, but because I also tutor in a bachelor and masters of education, and so that's all online.
Mm.
And I mean, the great thing about that is, you get 40 minutes in of an hour long, Zoom, and you can say, well, if there's no other questions, we're going to have an early mark.
That
But
is
I
nice.
also, yeah, I do find it to be, also, if there's somebody that's monopolizing, the time with the questions, it is a lot less of an issue on Zoom as well.
Yeah, I frankly, students just do not talk on Zoom, um,
No, no.
which is awkward for like a workshop, isn't it? Because like literally, it's not a lecture. You had the lecture. The point is, I need to like hear the answers from you in
Mm.
this class.
Especially that must be teaching medieval uh, language. That must, I mean, I assume that they come into it with no skills in medieval.
Oh, well, I was using the medieval literature, so they were reading it in translation, which I think is a huge shame, but I don't get to control that.
Ah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so there was none, and it actually led to some issues because I read them in the original, and like for one of the texts, the textbook that they were set, the guy just like changed pronouns for one of the figures in this poem, because he thought it made more sense.
Right. Okay. There you go.
Yeah, and so like, and so I got this as teaching plan from the teacher, and it was the wife's lament, and they said get the students to identify which kind of elements in this poem might give us a clue that it's a female speaker, because this is, yeah, the way that we know that in this poem is that the adjective endings that the speaker in this poem, the wife's lament, uses to describe themselves are feminine in the Old English, but obviously you don't get that in translation. Ich me full ye amore. Ye amore is feminine, whereas masculine would be ye amor. But obviously the students didn't know that, and so I was like, if that felt like a moment of the person who was setting that class, I guess not remembering the kind of stuff that a beginner doesn't know, and that's
Yeah.
so hard as a teacher.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to that point of, you're always going to have to do the introductory stuff.
Mm.
There are some things that, yeah, although, like you said, we don't need to discuss race. Well, although in because I also taught legal studies,
Cool.
um, so people that were going to go on and do justice studies or law or something at uni.
Hmm.
And so in Australia, we have in 1993 the government passed a native title where it created a mechanism based on a previous High Court ruling that allowed Indigenous people to apply for and be granted native title, which meant that they had ownership rights over over land in Australia, essentially, and that caused a lot of weird, ill-thought, racist kind of points of view. And almost 30 years later, in my legal studies classes, where we start talking about native title, or Mabo case, terra nullius, those same points of view are brought up. And because and the other thing is, those people that thought those things then went on and had kids and obviously interact with them, and they pick up these views, and then they're transmitted like that. I don't know where I was going with that. It's very annoying.
Well, that must be because I hadn't even thought about that, of like how recent it is that you're teaching the aftermath of it.
Mm. And yeah, and kids, clearly, kids are having things that are impressed upon them at home, and then they come in, and you're like, oh, that's racist, and so they're conflicted. Then
Have
I'm
you
being
ever,
told these things at home that
yeah, have you ever had students then who react negatively to you because of that?
yeah,
Ooh.
they have turned around, and I offer a pardon me, I offer a guided debate where they get to put their points of view out, you know, safely, because obviously we've also got Indigenous students,
Hmm.
and and quite often when that happens, all of the sorts of tropes come up of, well, they get more welfare and this and that,
Hmm.
and so I have prepared, and so I actually have the statistics on hand, and they go, oh, okay, and most of the time it's oh, okay, they're fine to just drop that that bigotry, not bigotry, that misheld
That
belief, I guess
misconception?
I would say. Yeah, misconception, absolutely. Um, it's only the kids where it, I guess, forms a part of their identity. Like, you find out they're a bit more national and a bit more, yeah, where that kind of grievance, it's turned into a grievance, which is part of their identity or their ideology, and then it becomes a bit more difficult to dislodge.
How does it go then with those ones? So when you bring up the statistics with the ones for whom it's part of their identity, what happens with those students?
They can, because they can't refute it, they just tend to ignore it. It's just well, that doesn't fit with belief, so oh well. I'll drop that argument out of my thing, but everything else stays the same. It doesn't have any
Ah,
larger impact. Yeah,
right. So they don't go like, I was wrong about this. Maybe I was wrong about some other things related to it.
yeah. They're just like, oh, okay, well, that's not a talking point for me anymore. Then, essentially,
Well, I mean, that's good that you sort of get rid of like, even if it's just one talking point at a time.
true, true.
And I quite like that idea of like taking students through a guided debate. I did a similar thing because I was aware that what I didn't want was for me to teach like a turf definition of gender or whatever, and students go out and repeat
Mm,
that in another module, and like I guess get marked down for it because that's not the standard view. Because to some degree, right, what's politically correct in these kinds of subjects, which are literally politics, becomes what's academically correct.
yep.
like I frankly think a student would be marked down as if she was or they were incorrect for writing that trans women are women. Sorry, aren't women. Um, even
Yeah.
though that's, you know, in certain contexts could be an argued point, let's say, or with certain qualifiers could be argued. Um, so, and also it's even gender theorists would argue that a woman as a social role isn't some defined category out there that you can say this exists and therefore we can put a tick that this is there. Anyway,
Mm.
moving on from that, but when I did that, therefore I caveated that like these are definitions that I'm teaching that are different. But I said, you know, you guys are open and if you think I'm wrong on how I'm defining these things, tell me in the class and we'll have a discussion about them. We'll let that be open. And we didn't really have any
Mm.
like we had one who sort of pushed an identity view of gender, which is in my opinion the worst of them all. And I basically I literally just like asked the question of I used myself as an example. I said, well, I'm a transsexual. I don't identify as transgender, but I'm people treat me differently because they perceive me as transsexual. So am I oppressed on the basis of my identity? Because I don't have that transgender identity. And then she was like, "Oh yeah, I guess that doesn't always work." And then yeah,
Mm.
they sort of move on. I think you can get students to drop individual points like that. Have you? Because you mentioned that you have Indigenous students, and you have these students who have frankly inherited a really let's say racist ideology from their parents.
Mm.
Have you had issues either with Indigenous students feeling unsafe from other students, or like students maybe from those kinds of parents feeling like they can't speak as openly as they would want to?
Um, so we're, yeah, like I said, we're low socioeconomic. We, I would say there's a lot of casual racism.
Hmm.
Um, and so on the whole, non-white students, um, whether they internalize it or whether they are playing along with it to get along and to not have it be an issue, that's more of a problem, I found. Like letting them understand that they can, this it's a space where you can say, hey, don't say that about me, or hey, that's racist, because we are also, even though uh, a third of Australians were born overseas, or parents were born overseas, with incredibly multicultural country. Like Italian people are mostly seen as white. Like
Mm-hmm.
we've assimilated so many. All of the Europeans that we used to be super racist to, now we see as white because we have other people from different countries coming in that, um, you know, it, 20 years ago it was Asian people. Now it's Muslim people. Well, now it's people who look like they are Muslims, whether they're Sikhs or whatever. Um, and yeah, so we're good at whitewashing a lot of different kinds of people, and then the ones that are left, just kind of go along with the inherent racism, unfortunately.
Oh God.
Um, yeah, which is difficult sometimes because I definitely understand why they would do that to, just laugh at the joke instead of, because it makes it easier. And then it might be that one time in the day that comes up, and the rest of the day they can just be happy and friends with their friends still. But yeah, so that's really difficult to have to navigate. And I
Yeah.
don't have a good normal, go-to response for that kind
So, so,
because
so
it's complex.
it's so complex. Like we did a week on affect theory, and Sarah Ahmed has this great essay where she talks about. I'm forgetting the title of it now, but she talks about like the affect aliens and the idea of like the feminist killjoy as like there's almost this pressure when say somebody's telling a bigoted joke, even if that joke describes you, to go along with it because challenging it almost like pits you against the emotional current of the whole group, and that can feel so awkward,
Mm,
and it can, especially if your acceptance within the group is already marginal or questioned, or unstable. Challenging that current literally can, well, not literally, but challenging that current can really threaten your social standing with other students. And that's a factor that
Yeah.
I didn't even think that I would have to think about before teaching, was the fact that what's happening in class affects how students are going to have their relationships with each other outside of class, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's hard enough navigating being an adolescent as it is,
Hmm.
let alone, like you said, pitting yourself against what was it, the emotional
The emotional like
level of the
current,
group?
the emotional current of the
Yeah, the
group.
emotional current. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, then obviously, because it's not a rational kind of debate. It's that, hey, it's just a joke. Like, why are you, like you said, the feminist killjoy or something? Why can't you just take a joke? Everyone's having a good time and you're just bringing us down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, funny enough, as like a trans person who like therefore like because I agree with them, frankly, can talk to like TERFs. I love doing that when
Mm,
they because it's more normalized, frankly, transphobic jokes in their spaces. But what I love doing is I just ask them, I don't understand it. Why is it funny? And then I get them to admit that it's because they think trans people are disgusting.
yeah,
Every
yeah.
time, it's great. Oh goodness. Um, this has been a really great conversation, and also like you're the first like basically like explicitly left aligned channel that I've done any collaboration with.
All
So
right.
yeah, I sort of got most of my audience from a very right wing channel. Well, not very right wing, but like relatively right wing, called History Debunked, and we did a series reading over critical race theory together, but like in a calm and
Mm,
pleasant manner, and it was an interesting experience, but I blew up in well, relative to what I started in size because I got a lot of viewers from him. And you're the
yeah.
first leftist that I've done anything with, so that's really cool.
Well,
Hopefully,
I don't think I got my SJW agenda in this time, but hopefully, if we again, that's when I'm gonna try and destroy your Western notions of liberty and individualism with my Islamic communism.
yes. Oh my God, I love it. I will. I will wear the cat-made hijab, or niqab.
No, this has been excellent. This has been, I mean, I've watched ContraPoints and then see terrible takes on Twitter, and that's about the extent of my trans discourse that I've uh, really been involved in before, and this has been great. And because initially when you said uh, something about gender critical, I went and looked it up, and yeah, I did a quick Google, and
Mm,
the only things that were coming up about it were how terrible it is, and they're turfs, and
yeah.
um, yeah. So, and I think it's great that you are in this space, and there's so much. I'm also so interested in all of your medieval studies and how that came about. So maybe that will be a different day.
I often, well, I have found medieval stuff a good way of like, well, a good to some extent a way of like getting people in if I gatekeep it the right way because Um, a lot of I often do videos on my channel, the ones that are medieval focused, where and by the way, I wanted it to my channel to be both history and politics. Some people have asked why didn't you do a separate channel for your politics, talk about politics,
Mm,
and my view is I want to draw people in with the politics and get them to read the medieval stuff, and I want to get people in with the medieval and get them thinking about the politics. Mary Beard has said in an
yeah,
interview she views the Roman world through this like left wing lens, and she wants to encourage others to do the same. And that's sort of subtly in there in her documentaries as well. And what the way I find is really good to do that is, I think we talked earlier about how when you look when people look up translations of medieval texts, it can seem like the past was much more like basically they have this view of the past that you get from romantic era paintings where everyone's white, everyone is acting
yeah,
straight, etc. And if you think about that painting, like a romantic painting, and the poems that would go along with it, they are translations and they're filtered through like an academic who has the power to essentially make something up. Like I told you stuff about the colonial, potentially colonial nature of discourse around whether people are transgender or travesti in Brazil. I could have made that
yep.
all up for all you know about the travesti. And you
That's
would
yeah. I would just nodded along and gone, wow, yeah,
Yeah, and like in the same way, when somebody's, I don't know, like Beowulf with his mighty sword threw the dragon, and he had a massive dick or whatever, and he was blonde haired and blue eyed. It's not like that's you can't make things up completely, but you can take a lot of liberty with translating these kinds of texts and putting them out into the world. And because those translations are publicly available, they first of all they attract more attention. They tend to be the national focus. Everyone wants to read Beowulf in translation, I should say. And it looks like because those translations are older and they're publicly available, that the past was more like romantic and conservative than it really was. And it's
Mm,
not that it was like completely liberal either. There's a sort of left wing reaction to that, which is like Vikings were genderqueer, fluid, pansexual, whatever,
yeah.
which is misguided, but not to be the
Oh,
enlightened
I
centrist.
don't worry. I've seen all that. I mean, as I said, being into the golden one, like, yeah. I mean, to him, they were basically 1950s, like, you know,
More like 19,
traditional nuclear families just with swords.
more like 1940s, if you catch my drift.
Yes, yes,
Oh
actually, and
God. Um,
probably also had those haircuts.
yes, but
But
like,
yeah, just on that notion that
mhm,
you just said, with going back to the Survive the Jive, and
oh,
Philosophy Tube made a video about him, and then Survive the Jive made a response that raised a couple of interesting points, and basically what you just said, he did say that, it was therefore evidence of SJW, blah 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 blah,
mm,
but just about individual historians being able to, because they are the conduit and the translators for everybody else, to be able to, or at the very least had that power to be able to change it, whether or not they were doing it um, subconsciously or not, but just playing into their own biases. I thought, yeah, that's a really interesting point about um, what we take for granted in history, and going all the way back to my first points about the kind of history curriculum thing in Australia at the current time is about who gets to frame our history and what therefore that history is. Is it just a bunch of facts and figures that have been established, or is it kind of an ever evolving field where you know people are learning new things about it, changing what we thought we might have known?
yeah, the way that you described that, how they were trying to change how history is taught in Australia to be like this is a bunch of dates and facts that you trivia that you memorize.
Yeah,
It's very alien to how I know history to be. And part of it is, let me put it this way, it's understandable why people would have that view. And we can see that to some extent in what your student did, who did that economic analysis of the French Revolution, is actually no, maybe that's harder because I don't know that area very well. But let's take, the Loeb's Classics Library, right? The red books you get in Waterstones.
mm,
Yeah. That can fit on a couple of bookshelves, and it's the texts which are deemed like classical texts. These are like the ancient Greek and Roman classics, and those have been
yeah,
around for hundreds of years and been studied to death. I can understand somebody seeing that bookshelf and seeing a department of classics and thinking your job as quote unquote historians is to tell people what's on that bookshelf so they don't have to bother reading it themselves. And what's on that bookshelf
yeah,
isn't going to change. But that's only looking at what has a facing page English translation on the bookshelf, and there's loads of text. I mean, for instance, this is one of my favorite texts from the ancient Roman world. It's amazing. It's basically a book on how to clock like not trans people, but like almost like a reverse of how we do it today. So like we think of clocking a trans person now as like I can tell their true sex behind their gender, and this one is like
mm.
here's how you can tell even if somebody's performing like a masculine gender if they're like a biological sissy or something. It's amazing. I know, and it's a whole guide. It's a whole guide to all sorts of like the shape of their hands or their jaw and their chin. Dude, they have like incel chin memes. They're like men with weak chins are to be avoided. They're like snakes. And
Oh goodness.
But the
Getting mogged by like ancient Greek textbooks.
yes. But the point is, like, there's all of that amazing queerness. They describe butch lesbians, for God's sake, but like
Mm,
nobody talks about that because it's not been translated into English, you know.
yeah, yeah.
And what I do, that's what I do on my channel. Loads of the texts I talk about have just not been translated into English yet, or even like a modern vernacular language. So first of all, no one else is going to cover it, and except for like a couple of the Latin channels, but they don't often cover those because those channels look at the classic text that everyone's heard about. So
Yeah.
there's that. But what I find is because I get to introduce it to them first, and because I put a barrier between, I never, this is a rule on my channel, I never show my own translation on the screen. I show the original, and sometimes I put a gloss on the side with vocabulary saying this is what each individual word means. So I show my evidence. So I've done videos, for instance, on a poem by Ausonius, who's a fourth century poet from Roman Gaul, writing about what looks like a bisexual throuple. It's really fun. I know, wholesome, and it's great, and I so I've got all of my evidence on the screen. Nobody can say that I'm completely fabricating what it is, but
Mm,
they can't read the translation in 5 seconds and say, "Oh, this is SJW bullshit. I disagree." Because what I do, I go through line by line and I say, "Okay, his girlfriend here is described as a Leanea. What does this mean in the context?" And then we sort of unpack that. And the word lioness is basically like dominatrix in certain contexts.
yeah.
And that forces them to sit through and also take the theory stuff with it. I've done that with Beowulf and toxic masculinity. I'm like, I think it's very easy for people to say, "Oh, Beowulf is a hero about men with big sword dicks, like fighting monsters with tiny sword dicks," and God, and they're like, "Oh, this toxic masculinity stuff is bollocks." But like, it, if I'm presenting it as like a class, as we're going to look at the truth of what Beowulf is, and people I think can't resist the allure of the Old English being in some way the truth because it literally is the original. They have to sit
Yeah.
through me saying, right, this is toxic masculinity and this is how we can see it in the text because they can't read the text on their own without me in the video. And that has been a great
Yeah.
way of getting people to be more sympathetic to theory. I've had people say that I'm more sympathetic to the ideas of like toxic masculinity or like gender norms or whatever, because the way you've explained it in your videos. So putting frankly, it's an intellectual and it's an elitist barrier, but putting the translation barrier up can be a way of getting people to be more open minded in certain instances. I've found.
Yeah. I think that ties nicely into that conception of, teaching as just delivering the knowledge that's already been agreed upon, as opposed to like teaching as a vocation, education as an act in itself. And how sometimes, you can't just give people the translation because then they can just look at it and go, oh well, that's bullshit, doesn't fit my narrative, and leave it. Like, you have actually had to think about how you're teaching, how you're
Yeah.
educating people.
Well, like,
Yeah.
and also, frankly, with a lot of, I take the example of like dog whistles today, right on the right. A quick thing, by the way,
Mm.
about Survive the Dry. He literally, I don't know why people claim that he's not. He literally has the Nazi tattoo on his chest. Like what? Sorry, I've had the discussion, and they're like, I don't know. Maybe he doesn't know. He has a master's in fucking medieval studies. Of course he knows. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Just that drives me nuts. But like, yeah. Oh my God. It's and I think I've forgotten what I was going to um
Oh,
go
no.
in here now. I'm so
he's,
sorry.
he, he's foiled you again.
Oh my God, he has. He really has. What a weirdo. What a bloody. It's fine. I'm gonna be chill. Um, um oh yes, that was it. It's like so in the video I talked about with the sexual politics of Visigothic Spain. That was based on an author who fucking nobody. We think of the Visigoths as these like buff, manly dudes, right? But one of their
Mm.
most famous poets was this guy called Eugenius of Toledo. His father, at least, was a Gothic warlord, and so he was of Gothic descent. And he seems to have been gay. He was accused of homosexuality. He does poems about this. I'm doing a full video later on him because there's so much there. But he preserves these 17 proverbs that the Visigoths said in their daily lives, and it's our kind of stuff, like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Their equivalent of that is
Yeah.
a live kitten is better than a dead lion, which is, I think, cute. Um,
Hmm.
but there's loads of sexual stuff in there which literally makes no sense, not just from a sexual angle, from any angle, unless you not just know the language, but can compare it to other instances. So, like the first of these proverbs is a cold man is the literal translation, I should say. A cold man is vainly girded in warfare with armor. His exterior is worth nothing when his own virtue is lacking. And people are like, what the hell does that mean? A cold man. There's no point arming a cold man for battles. And you need to remember, well, you need to be aware that in the Greco-Roman context, women were described as cold and wet, and men were described as hot and dry. So describing him as a cold man is implying effeminacy and perhaps even homosexuality. And medical textbooks
Hmm.
at the time imply that homosexuals have like a wet humoric and cold humoric balance. Um, but a translation, here's the thing, a literal translation will not get that because the Latin word is frigidus, which
Yeah.
is cold. So I
Oh, what's the
advocate
Latin word?
frigidus. It's where we got our word frigid from, cold,
Yeah,
or
right.
refrigerator.
That's what I just thought. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
the Latin original is frigidus in bellis frustra preginditur armis, nil valet exterius defi tubi propria virtus. There we go. We've always do some kind of Latin poetry on my streams. But yeah, frigidus is the word for cold, and these, by the way, these Greco-Roman like dualisms of like women being cold and wet and men being hot and cold, we still have like atavisms of them today. We describe the humanities, right, as soft subjects, and the sciences, which are more
Yeah.
associated with men, as hard. We describe men as
Yeah.
hot-headed sometimes. It's fascinating. So there's so much going on there, but so in order to get around that, I actually advocate for what I call queer translation, which is deliberately putting the sex back into and putting the queerness back into these. So when I don't translate that proverb as a cold. There's no point armoring a cold man for battles. I say there's no point armoring a sissy for battles, and this leads to some tension
Yeah.
with people because like the more conservative minded people who are looking at my videos and want to think of the Visigoths as these tough manly types, whatever, they don't want to think about that. So it's very easy for them to say, oh, I'm just making it up, like SJW kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that so much because I don't want to send them away, be like, you don't know enough, go and learn Latin and then come back. But there's nothing else I can do except for have them sit down and read a book by a professor explaining all of this stuff in Latin, which there are books out there I can recommend that are really good, but they're not going to do that.
No. Yeah, that's so interesting that you have to include the connotations as well.
Yeah.
Because yeah, like the literal and figurative language, like the figurative stuff isn't going to come across through just an English translation.
Well, let's think about this on how you would do it with a student, right? Let's say you have a foreign student who's ESL and they're not that good, but they're using a term.
Yeah.
They're using because I've had a French friend sort of accidentally do this. Like they use the N word, but they don't realize that it's a slur. How would you explain to them
Yeah.
that it's a slur?
Yeah.
Because if they say, "Oh, this is just the word for black," how would you explain to them that it's not a
Yeah.
slur? No, I must think that's a genuine question. Like, how would you?
I really have no idea. I would, I guess, say, oh, that's a word that we don't say, and then maybe try at the break after everybody's gone to talk them through it.
But when you talk them
That's,
through it, what would you say to them?
I have no idea. This is making me uncomfortable just thinking about having to have this conversation.
Well, okay.
I honestly have no idea. Like the ones that I've confronted are Southeast Asian students not understanding colloquialisms. And there was
Hmm.
a boy in year 11 this year who, on an exam, he put his hand up, and I went over to him because I was invigilating, and he said, "What does this mean?" And I'd realized that it was such an oft-used colloquialism. I just assumed that it was just the proper way to say something.
Right, yeah,
Yeah,
and
and I
go on, please.
oh yeah, and I just had to kind of explain in in whispers to him what it meant, and he still really didn't have a great grasp of it. And yeah, I was like, oh wow, that's such a shortcoming on my behalf.
Well, because it's an institutional thing as well, right? And this is one of these things where when you say to people tests have like a racial bias, they're like, oh, but like, I really hate people being glib about that, when it's a real thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and well, like, and because like the way you would explain this, presumably, is you would like say, well, look, these words, right, are used in certain ways in other contexts, and it has these obvious implications in those contexts. Like it's obviously negative in those contexts, and that's most of the time that it's
yeah,
used. That's difficult for me because I can't do that. Like when I tell people that the word frigidus implies that they're a sissy, even though if they look up in the dictionary, it won't say sissy, it'll say cold, in the Latin
yeah.
dictionary. Which is how it's also used to literally mean cold, because they believed that cold literally made you more effeminate. Um, no, I know. It's interesting. Um, there's this weird racial climatic thing as well, where like in the north where it's too cold, the body overcompensates by getting too much heat, and that makes us more bellicose. That's why you have the Germanic warrior trope in the violent Germanic barbarian in Roman culture. Whereas in like say Egypt or Nubia, where there's too much heat, the body compensates by producing an excess of liquid and cooling it down, and this makes them more effeminate and hypersexual, which is why you have the hypersexualized black man trope in ancient Roman art and
Right.
literature. I know it's so
Wow.
interesting. But they also sort of believe that if you move to the Mediterranean, which is coincidentally right where the best racial climate is, as in the climate that produces the best races, you have the Mediterranean is moderate. It's not too hot or too cold. It's just right, and you can therefore you can therefore you can therefore control your
Talk about
mind.
biological determinism. Wow.
Yeah. And so like that's why for the Romans, they could have emperors coming from Africa or wherever else, and they could become Roman. Is like if you move to the
Yeah,
Mediterranean, you can
wow.
become civilized. Yeah. Anyway, but like the point is that
Geographically assimilate.
yes.
That's so interesting. Wow.
Um, and then like
Huh.
I can't do that. Like there's no way that I can get that person who disagrees with my translation of frigidus as sissy, because the only way I could do it is I could show, right, look in these contexts, like this medical textbook is saying the frigidus, I don't know, leads to so and so things, but you sometimes you don't even have direct evidence as that. It might just be like this
Yeah,
person is described as a bit of a cold person, and they're also cross dressing, etc., etc.
yeah.
It's so hard. And there is a it's something I struggle with, like, because my YouTube is basically I'm teaching on my YouTube, right? It's the kind of stuff that I don't get paid to teach, but I
Mm.
wish I could. Um, and so teaching is so relevant, and it's something that I've struggled with. I don't have an answer to it. I haven't figured it out. Maybe one day.
No.
But like, because it's
Yeah,
it's
that,
one of
I
the
mean,
big. Sorry, but the queerness is just not visible, because this is the way I like to think about it. Is that like the queerness in the past is spoken in dog whistles, and if you can only understand a dog whistle if you speak that language well enough to be immersed in the media of that time. Like a foreign student
yeah,
probably wouldn't understand. I'm trying to think. Thug, right? They might use the word thug, not realizing that it's a dog whistle,
yeah,
because
yeah,
they're not consuming like Fox News all the time or this media. They don't see it being used in the ways that are negative, so they don't understand the full meaning, and they just look it up in a dictionary. They're like, oh, violent criminal, you know.
yeah. And then if someone's trying to tell them and they, yeah, open the dictionary, they're like, well, you're full of crap.
Yeah. Have you ever had student out of interest like challenge you on that, be like, you're wrong, like you're full of crap in a class?
Um, no, I don't think so. Um, I so when I particularly with modern history, obviously aspects of values and ideology are going to come up,
Hmm.
and so I talk to the kids I teach, and I because obviously perspective and bias are things that we look at when we're doing source analysis and evaluation, and I will often say, now look, everybody has a perspective, and I have a perspective that I'm going to be imparting when I'm teaching these things. And I say, you have to try and figure out, though, and be aware that maybe my perspective is going to go across into bias. And it's important that you are aware that I could certainly be biased,
Mm.
and to be aware of that. And yeah, so I try and make it as transparent as possible, and that I think has saved me maybe those things where people feel like they're being quote unquote brainwashed or just sold propaganda or ideology. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
mm,
because I mean, generally when we say brainwashing, we don't imagine the people who are doing the brainwashing coming up to be like, "Come along for your brainwashing session now. We're going to scrub your brain nice and clean, make it nice and smooth." Um, maybe people think that. I don't know. Um, so therefore, yeah, being open and honest about it, I think, can certainly, I guess, get ahead of some of those accusations. Um, yeah, because I mean, I've had because I actually use those in my class partly because I love these texts and I want more people to learn about them. I had one student question me, and that's always why when I gave them the original when I get what I gave them was my queer translation, which let them see the stuff in it. But I also gave the original, and she asked. It was one of the Visigothic proverbs I mentioned earlier, and it was the proverb in English means something like when a woman, child, or a well-fed slave gets fucked, the common people sing songs about this, but those songs are silent about us, or those people are silent about us. Basically saying we don't, manly men, we don't bottom like a woman. Unfortunately, a child. They were not we didn't have child safety laws back then, or a well-fed slave. Because basically, this idea of like a sugar daddy, right? You provide them the money and then or their living and their income, and therefore you get to fuck them.
yeah.
Very grim stuff. But the verb for that is the original doesn't say it's cum coniux natus vel servus alumnus peccat, which the verb peccat is to sin or they sin. But like again, that's one of those ones. If you translate it literally, when a wife, child, or a well-fed slave sins, the common people sing songs about it, and they don't sing any songs about us. You're like, what on earth does that mean
Mm,
when they sin? But then you have to know that in the context of all of it, like sinning can have sexual meanings. It's a dog whistle, and so like she asked,
yeah.
"You've said that they get fucked. Does it actually say that they get fucked?" I was like, "Yeah, there's the word. It gets fucked." And I could explain that to her. But having that there, like the original language there, was a good means of, I guess, to show that I'm not completely making it up. Although even then, she has to
Yeah.
take my word on it. The student who questions me. Um, it's tricky. It's tricky. Um, it's fun though, and
I think a lot of it is.
go on.
Sorry.
No, go on, please.
I think a lot of it is having intentionality to how you navigate these things. I think thinking about them and identifying that there could be problems,
Mm.
and then thinking about how you are going to approach them. I think that is one of the important things about it, as opposed to the teacher who might just never give a second thought because they've said, "Well, I'm right, and you are dumb, so you can shut up." Basically, as
Y-
much as sometimes I would like to say that to my sevens. Uh,
Oof, magoof. Yeah, like I think it's probably far easier, right, to just like you're dumb, like shut up and learn the
yeah.
things.
uh,
Which I respect though. I respect that as a teacher, you're putting that work in. Um, and yeah, with that being said, and maybe unless people have questions, maybe this would be a good time on a nice happy note to end to wrap up on the stream. What I was gonna do, hold on. I'm showing you, and you can't see it, but I'm showing your channel on the screen. Guys, go and subscribe to
oh,
Only Dog.
wonderful.
It's a great channel. So what actually got me into? Oh, so first of all, he does like discussions of books, which is quite cool. Like the Michael Brooks, not Michael Knowles. Goodness. Um, uh, good lessons learned from bad people. He also does Dungeons. It's so cool that you're into Dungeon Synth. I actually wrote the first Dungeon Synth fan magazine back in the day, like as a teenager. And I used to make
Oh,
music
really?
as well. Yeah, Dungeons of Darkness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I wrote that as a teenager, and I used to make music for it as well. I've got some on my channel, but they're privated now. Um,
Oh, wow. That's sick.
yeah, so I know what you mean. That it's great music to study to, isn't it? Um,
I will just chuck it on in the background. I mean, I know I shouldn't like it, but Burzum is still excellent. I mean,
Yeah.
but yeah.
See, I'm really
Anyway, I'm
lucky in
pretty
that.
sure.
Hmm? Go on.
I was
Sorry.
going to say, I'm pretty sure Varg lost all of the royalties and rights to that anyway because he tried to race some guy in his little like Jeep that he had and in a drag
What?
race, and then lost it all, and then was like, "Yeah, well, I wanted to lose it anyway, so I can focus on my
Oh, my racism.
RPG game." Anyway, so
What the
yeah,
hell, dude? That like larpy like camo van. What on earth, my man?
I know he is so bizarre.
But like honestly, look, I know he was spreading bad ideas and he's terrible, but that channel was so funny. Like there was so much
I know.
gems. Like when he had that video
Yeah.
talking about a healing plant, I was like, oh my god, he's gonna give us the weed take. It's gonna go Joe Rogan on us.
There's a Twitter that I can't even remember what it's called, but and it basically goes through and just like reposts all of Varg's old things that he did on Twitter, and just like some of the crap that he either posted, responded to, or the things that he liked, like almost getting into thirst trap territory, liking some things. I'm like, oh Varg, you're not so different than us mortals.
Yes. Oh my god. It's like
Uh,
I'm so into my like pregnant wife with like with like her 10th kid inside her or whatever. And sure, funny. Funnily enough, though, I was gonna say I actually
Goodness.
found your channel initially, because I got like not in like a creepy way, just like super obsessed with Abby Shapiro because she's fascinating.
Right?
Yes.
There's so much there. It's such an interesting phenomenon. Her channel.
Yeah. Like, okay, this is like my sort of almost. It almost feels like she's on this train, like running with the whole like trad wife aesthetic thing, and like it's almost like a bike where if she were to stop to think about it, it almost seems like she would collapse, and then but I have no
Mm,
idea whether she's authentically into a lot of this stuff or if she's just like convinced herself that it. And I think there are some elements that like would be. I think she is a genuinely like warm and loving person, regardless. But you get the real sense that she's never like, or maybe I don't even know if she's ever seriously questioned things. But I think what it is because it's so stereotypical. I'm suspicious, and you're naturally suspicious of it. In the same way as you meet like a really stereotypical gay guy, you're like, "Are you putting that on? Is that a bit?" It doesn't feel like
yeah.
anyone would do that, you know?
Yeah. No. One of the videos that I made about it, I pointed out the contrast to when she was, doing basically conservative talking points and how she was just kind of rambling them off. And then as soon as she started talking about fashion, she just brightened up and her voice changed and she was so enthused and passionate. And I said, yeah, like it's so sad that Ben Shapiro is her brother because she could have just been had a great like enjoyable YouTube career as a like fashion blogger or something.
Yeah,
But instead, she's yeah,
you're 200% right. Like she has a I'm sorry I interrupted you, but like she has a genuinely great personality, and she seems bubbly and nice, you know?
mm, yeah, yeah. And there's because I rarely watch her videos. But I'm still subscribed to her, so I see what's coming out, and yeah, it's she could have been like cutesy, hallmarky, yeah. Instead, it's got to be like, yeah, the gays are ruining America. Here's why conservative and terrible.
And
Poor woman.
so something random side note also. Have you seen any of the videos with her husband?
No, I haven't.
Like
Oh,
he's he's just got like he's got an impressive ability to like exude like concentrated levels of prick just from seeing 2 seconds of him before he opens his mouth. You're like, this is a prick.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Well, that might explain some of it then.
Yeah, and I mean, I saw one comment
Also,
like, oh, I'm sorry.
no, no, you're right.
I saw like this comment by this woman claiming that she like works with abuse victims, and she claimed that the dynamic of how they spoke mirrored those of like abuse victims. I'm like, I really hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't be shocked, you know?
Oh,
Like maybe that's just how
yeah.
conservatives do it, you know?
Oh dear.
But like, I think I do think that's a lot of like, I guess the like Abby's project with the because there was a fascinating Q&A she did when where one of her followers was like, I'm infertile and I could get IVF treatment, but it would like bankrupt me to do so. What do you think I should do? Should I give up on my dream of being a parent, or should I maybe adopt? And Abby was like, you should do anything you can, borrow money from your family or whatever, remortgage your home or whatever to get the IVF treatment because it's so necessary. And she basically said that like having that your biological kids and being a mother, whatever, will inherently be more fulfilling than anything else that could be gained from that. And that's why I made the analogy of like she's like on a bike almost, because I get this sense of if that woman were to
Mm,
follow her advice, she's sunk so many costs into this, like it's a sunk cost fallacy. She's sunk so much into having this kid that she almost like has to start enjoying being a housewife at that point. And I wonder if there's elements of that going on
yeah.
with the trad wife aesthetic. It's like celebrate being a trad wife for its own sake, because this lifestyle won't give you stuff that is generally recognized as enjoyable, like independence or finances or whatever. Yeah, it's dark.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's so much there with her channel that, yeah, I do feel like some of the just dunking on her for being, basically an attractive Ben Shapiro misses.
Yes. And like, why? Her looks don't matter to this stuff.
Yeah, it's so strange.
Yeah, and like, although so my brother is straight and he's like very into her, and he showed me one of these memes, people being weird about her breasts, and I learned that there's a phrase. I think it's either for like Jewish women's breasts or specifically for Abigail Shapiro's breasts, and they call them kazar milkers, which
Yeah, there is a sizable online thing concerned with her body parts.
it's awful and
I've
it's
seen more pictures of Abby Shapiro's feet than I think anyone else's.
fucking hell. It's disgusting
Yeah.
and creepy.
Oh, it's wild.
It is. She is a fascinating character, though. Honestly, too.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, and she seems likable as well.
Yes.
She definitely seems like you could hang out with her. Maybe without her husband around then.
But yeah, because she reminds me of like, because I actually had and this is one of like the wankiest sentences I like to say about myself. When I was studying Latin at the monastery, I the other one is I was part of a secret Latin speaking society at the University of Oxford. That's the other one, which is true.
Are you
Isn't
also a spy?
No, I wish. But anyway, like this ex-nun friend was like extremely hardcore Catholic, similar to Abby Shapiro. Although, funnily enough, she has now decided she doesn't want kids, which like good for her. But
No.
yeah, but she unironically, I think because I had a boyfriend at the time and I was living as a man, she called me a sodomite. But but you could still kind of get on with her in this with this weird sort of. I feel like
Yeah.
Abigail Shapiro would be that friend as well. Like she wouldn't be like, here's the thing, she wouldn't like make it a problem for you guys to be friends. She was like, I think
Mm.
this is wrong, but I still like you as a person. Let's stay in touch. And I actually think, because here's the thing I say with like and it's also one of the reasons I'm trying to reach out to gender critical channels is that I think a lot of discourse, right? We talk about online discourse as if we talk about it like we're Ben Shapiro and we're like this is facts and logic, but I think it's about relationships. At the end of the day, it's like this is
Mm.
communities, and I'm in this community, I'm out of that, and I think Abigail would be the kind of person who can she can I can not keep you within her community, even if even in a context where many people would exclude somebody from their like immediate social circle. And I actually think that makes her more effective as a political advocate as well. Because that's the big fear with
Mm.
cancel culture, right? People are afraid of cancel culture because it threatens to let politics intervene and change your social relationships. And I think part of the reason she's good is that she sort of you don't get the sense from watching her video that if she had a friend who came out as gay, that she would just never speak to them again, and that makes her more likable.
Yeah. Yeah. It transcends, doesn't it?
Mm.
Because there's not that threat, that inherent threat there. You can sit down and maybe have a difficult conversation because you know at the end of it you're going to be okay.
That's exactly it. And I've had that on my, because like, I did a series of about 10 videos with that History Debunk channel reading over critical race theory, and he was quite opposed to it. And frankly, his audience were incredibly racist. One of them, by the way, I had like both the trans flag and the ace pride flag up in the background, and someone
Mm.
got left a comment saying that I had the pedo mafia flag. Which,
Ah,
however you interpret, I love it so much because it's either the pedo wing of the mafia or the mafia wing of the pedos, which so much going on there. Like, nice kid you have there. Would be a shame if some.
I made him an. Oh goodness, yeah.
Yeah, and but like the thing is, like,
Yeah, that's it.
let's go on. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, at first they were really hostile like that, but over time, as they saw that like he and I still kept a good rapport, we were still civil, and even sort of started to like each other. They became much more amenable. They were like, "Oh, I can kind of see what Bella is saying about, I don't know, racial bias in policing or whatever," because they
Mm.
felt they didn't feel like they had their guard up, you know?
Yeah, and I was gonna say a lot earlier with the, I guess, questioning narratives and stuff. Like we're also encouraged to draw battle lines, you know, and so if something, um, sex, what is it? Sex discourse,
Mm.
sex dysphoria. If that's raised, well, that's something used by the other side. So we better just join arms in our little shield wall, and we can't let it hurt us. So we can't have any of that kind of thing. And so that kind of, I don't know, partisan danger threat, yeah, doesn't do a lot for the learning.
No, it doesn't. I don't think people like really learn things when they're afraid or angry, and such like this.
No, they might comply, but
Yeah. Mm.
they're not. Yeah.
And funnily enough, that's a huge turf talking point, and it's one that they can sometimes use to be very cruel. Like, and I part of the reason I like when I started changing my mind and I suffered a lot of mental breakdown is like a common turf talking point is that and a similar one to what racists do is that they say, oh well, they don't actually accept trans people; they just comply because otherwise they'll be cancelled or whatever. Um,
Mm.
and like it really messed with me at the time, because it felt so weird because I see like hug boxing it both done by trans people and by cis people where they'll tell trans people they look really like a man or really like a woman, regardless of how they actually look. And so for being a trans
Mm.
person in that context, you have no way to accurately know how you appear to others. So the safest thing to do, frankly, in that context, is to assume the absolute worst, which is really damaging to your psyche and mental health. Which is why, for me personally, I find it very liberating to embrace gender critical ideas and say, well, yeah, I'm a man. I don't need to pretend I'm and call myself a woman, and therefore the parts of my body and my being which indicate that I'm of the male sex, I don't have to feel like ashamed of them or fearful that I need to hide them, and this allows me to be more free with my expression than I might otherwise be. Like I can tie my hair up if it's hot, rather than having it loose, like because
Mm.
that hides my brow bone better, etc. That's why I have a stream called Gender Critical Trans Liberation, where I talk about the ways in which gender critical ideas can actually be beneficial for trans people. But the point is, sorry, to go back to battle lines, is that people who are looking at it from a perspective of battle lines, they'll use that idea of like, oh, they don't really accept you. They're just complying, like you said, with what you want. That can be used to try to get at trans people's psyche and mess with their mind, because it really did mess with my mind. I had no idea how everyone was perceiving me. That's really weird. I think whether cis or
Yeah.
trans, or not even with gender issues, you know. Um,
Yeah,
and
that just reminded me of ContraPoint's incel video, where she was talking about how incels will go on these forums to get like the opposite of Hugbox, and
yes,
how she used to do it as well on these really toxic trans forums, where people would post videos, I mean photos, only to get clocked, like to do it to get clocked, and that's a really interesting, like, yeah, like I don't know,
I mean,
yeah,
here's the thing. Like
people are
yeah,
complex.
I do that, and even arguably still do it with turfs, because over the last year, I like sort of was in discussion groups, which are like debates between trans people and like turfs, and we had to very heavily moderate those groups, but they can function. And now I have like casual acquaintances in those groups, and I felt more real hanging out just socially in those online spaces, because I knew that
Mm,
they weren't trying to flatter me. They had no reason to try and flatter me. So
yeah,
when one of the turfs said that my voice sounds possibly feminine, I only believed it coming from her, whereas I never believed it from anyone
yeah.
else. Yeah. And that it's really fascinating the ways that emotion like messes with your psyche. It's one of the reasons I had a mental breakdown about it when I changed my mind on this stuff. It's like, you get to find a way that you can know something that's like not stable and not going to be challenged, but that stable thing is like that you're a terrible piece of shit or whatever, which is not
Yeah.
true, but like whatever. It was very dramatic. But yeah, no, you can use that stuff to drop battle lines, or you can use it in a kind way. And I think people who are trying to draw battle lines will do so regardless. But somebody who is able to present themselves like Abby as being still like welcoming and embracing, I think that's so much more effective than shutting people out. Jordan Conley, a TERF is it's an acronym for trans exclusionary radical feminist, but usually it's just used for somebody who's being shitty to trans people online, which is probably 90% of the people who that is the case for. A lot of people are very terrible to trans people online. But yeah, I'm really interested in the ways in which marginalized people like lose a grip on reality because of all of this, because of the way that we.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lack of living in an authentic context, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is like, and so I got mad that I was, because I got in trouble. Like the professor had a stern word with me because I included Kathleen Stock in my class on trans theory. Because Kathleen Stock's central argument is that when what trans people are doing is we're immersed in a fiction. Like when a trans woman says she's a woman, she's performing a fiction, which is a sort of pretense, which is beneficial for her mental state. But Kathleen Stock argues that we don't believe that we're women in the way that's like a literal way, which is why she doesn't say that trans women aren't women. She says that we aren't literally women, and she makes the analogy of a play. She says when you're watching a play and a character dies, you don't rush onto stage to get medical assistance and to give first aid to the actor because you recognize this play.
Mm,
But that doesn't mean that it's not real. It can be really important. You can that play can change your life, and seeing that death scene can really move you to tears, as if the person was really dying. But you're also at the same time aware that it's not a reality. She thinks that that's the case with trans
mm,
people, and that's why. it's important to like respect that fiction for trans people. She's making the trans rights argument, but nobody listens to that, and they just call her a turf. But that's exactly it, right? It's like I think that trans people struggle with the fact that the reality is that we are living a fiction, which doesn't mean that we're delusional, or whatever, or that we need to stop. But I think the problem is trying to like treating that our performance as if it's not a fiction leads to people putting more trust in it than it needs. And I think that's why hug boxing exists. It's an attempt to try to, like you
Yeah.
say, coerce and manifest that in everybody else, to get rid of any signs in your environment that challenge that fiction, that break the immersion in the fiction. And I don't think that's mentally healthy for us as a community to do. So yeah.
Yeah, that's no, I'm big on analogies, and as you were just saying that about the play, all I could think of was like wrestling in America, like professional WWE wrestling, where people will
Yes.
make fun of them. Oh, well, that's all fake. That's all fake. But yeah, the emotions aren't fake, and the investment isn't fake, and they know that they're performing, but there's still that like intensity, and people live their entire lives around it.
It's kayfabe, yeah. But there's nothing
Yeah,
wrong with
yeah.
that. Yeah. But here's the thing, like it would be a real problem if I'm trying to think about it. Yeah, okay, like it would be a real problem if the police came and arrested so and so because they slapped a wrestler and the match hadn't begun or whatever, and that's assault. We don't do that because we
Yeah.
recognize it's a fiction. And that's sort of Kathleen Stock's argument, is that sometimes in certain contexts, treating the fiction or not recognizing the reality where it's necessary can cause harm, but other times the fiction is really beneficial. And I think
Mm.
it's such a good angle to think about trans existence, and it's beneficial. And everyone just calls her a turf, and they try to get her cancelled. Sorry, not cancelled, but like they tried to get her fired from her university and all of this stuff. And I was like, have you read the book? I don't think you've read the book. See
No,
me after class.
no, it doesn't. Oh, that's so interesting. Is perception shifting? Do you think on her, or it's just stuck?
Like, what annoys me with how people have been treating her in the public eye is that, this is why I said earlier, people take these like symbols in the gender war and they take Kathleen Stock as like this this turf, and they also therefore assume a lot of stuff about what she says that she doesn't say. And so for instance, if you go on
Mm.
like YouTube, the New Culture Forum, Kathleen Stock, show it on the screen for everyone else, Kathleen Stock, trans women, it'll show up with her interview with the New Culture Forum. Yeah, and the title of that is Kathleen Stock, OBE, trans women aren't women, but that's not the quote. The quote is trans women aren't literally women, or I don't believe that trans women are literally women, by which she means biologically. But
Yeah,
this thumbnail and everything, it sets her up as this symbol of of anti-trans rhetoric, right? It's because that is directly anti-trans, like directly contradicting the claim that trans women are women, when what her argument is more complicated. There's so much stuff in the book which you would never expect a TERF to say. She literally says that everyone should be more non-binary. Like what? Um, she says that
yeah,
you don't need to have like surgeries and stuff to be valid as a trans person. We should be discouraging people from saying that they need to like be on hormones to be trans or whatever. There's so much that she makes, and she says that we should make an effort to sort of go along with and humor the fiction of trans people, even if perhaps it's difficult to do so because they have a lot of feminine or masculine signifiers. And that's the too cute argument within trans discourse, right? There's so much stuff that she does which
yeah,
is really very pro-trans, and nobody gives a blind shit about that, except for like the few radical feminists in like her Goodreads reviews who are going, "Why doesn't she hate trans people? God damn it, I feel so betrayed." Like,
yeah. They're the only ones that can see those arguments.
yeah, it's like she's not calling them troons. What the hell? Like, God. Because I see like Mr. Menno, for example, has done a video defending Kathleen Stock, like, oh, this news reporter tried to go after her, oh, social justice warriors gone mad, blah blah blah, and but then he has another video criticizing Debbie Hayton and saying like Debbie Hayton is a trans woman in the UK who like she acknowledges that she's a man. She calls herself a man, and it's like, this isn't contradictory with being trans, etc. Some
Yeah.
TERFs love her and some TERFs hate her. And she does some work with some TERF organizations. And Mr. Menno is like, Debbie Hayton is a wolf in sheep's clothing. She's like disrespecting the word woman or whatever by still calling herself a trans woman, even though she acknowledges she's a man. And I'm like, Kathleen Stock in her own fucking book says that she calls trans women and not like. And so I'm like, did you read the book of the feminists you're claiming? And he, ironically, he has a video on his channel where he's like, he shows this woman at this speech saying like, 50% of the world's population are women, so why aren't you listening to women? Which is a stupid argument because not all women in the world agree with radical feminist talking points. But beside the point,
Yeah.
you clearly like did not listen to the woman who you've been defending on your channel, have you? Like, it's ridiculous. But again, it's because people take Kathleen Stock as this symbol of turfism, and they assume everything that she says, regardless of what her actual book is, when her book is amazingly well researched and informed. And I know that I've basically been shilling for her book this whole time, but it's because I think one last thing I'll say also as like a teacher is that she is committed to steel manning like the gender performativist and gender essentialist views, the arguments that trans people use for why trans women are women. She's committed to those to
Yeah.
steel manning them so she doesn't caricature them. And this means that in her book you have a great and accessible summary of gender performativism, gender essentialism, etc. And that's really useful to give to students to be like, this is a quick introduction to it. And you can also get the radical feminist take. You get 3 in about 40 pages,
Yeah.
But I was told very roundly that I must not include Kathleen. So what I did with my class was I gave her as extra reading at the end of my class. I gave out some printouts of her book, and I said, I think this is a really good book on trans issues. Go read it. And let's say I've lost a friend, a sort of professional friend over that. So that was kind of peak, but I felt it had to be done.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that they can't. I mean, going back to that Abby Shapiro thing, about the fact that because obviously you would have argued your case, and I'm sure in good faith, because you were doing it in completely good faith. And then the fact that they are unable to take you at face value and say, oh, well, maybe we, at the end of it, even if I don't understand or agree, we can have this different opinion. It's very unfortunate.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning, I do understand because they're really difficult emotionally as ideas to get with. Like, I did suffer a mental breakdown, and I was, very anxious, and I was crying a lot for a few months because it causes a huge shift in how I saw myself. But like, I think I've done a good job of explaining why I'm much more stable now. Because like now, after having gone through all that, I'm less anxious in social presentations about, or just appearing in public about appearing as a man, because my like male features no longer contradict who I claim to be. People aren't going to see my jawline or my brow bone and be like, oh, Bella, who's calling herself a woman, is actually a man. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm a man. I also dress quote unquote like a woman, as you would probably, not you, only dog, but like as this hypothetical person would probably say that, you're a man, but why are you dressing like a woman? I'm like, well, I'm not. Women don't have to dress a certain way. I'm just wearing clothes that I like and which fit my body type.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that, and it's much more liberating. Frankly, here's like, even within like male spaces. Like I mean, I never like had started using women's spaces anyway, but like I use men's toilets, and trans people are always like, "Oh my god, you'll get assaulted in the men's loos." I'm like, "No, I won't." People like are annoying. They're like, "Oh, wrong bathroom, love. Wrong bathroom." And I'm like, "No, I'm not. I will piss on your shoes right here, right by the urinal. Um, don't don't try me." But
That should
like
be if you do go and do that big trans study, that should be the title for your paper. I'll
this is
piss on your shit.
This is trans praxis. This is direct political action. It's like a bunch of trans women going into men's bathrooms and pissing on shoes. But like, oh, speaking of tangentially related topic, like, credit to Dave Chappelle, right? I don't know if you've seen his stand up, The Closer, but he like made
No.
Okay, but he's like a cis man. He made trans jokes that were really funny, and they weren't the attack helicopter or I identify as jokes. He actually did it, um, and they're very good jokes. And I've genuinely never seen a cis person make good original trans jokes like that. So credit to him, man. Like,
Yeah.
gotta take your hat off to him on that because his joke, and this is going to be a terrible retelling of it, but it was like he was talking, as a man. He's like, guys, wouldn't it be weird if some trans dude came up to you next to you in the urinal and put his ass in the urinal? Wouldn't that be weird? Uh,
uh,
See, it's good. It's good, and
yeah.
there's not just with the research, right? There's when we get past the transphobia, there's so much like great humor with trans people that we could get at, but we're sort of held back by bigotry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, there you go. There's a SJW uh, reason to make comedy better. That will make comedy better, I should say,
Well,
for all the sissies out there.
oh hell
I
yes,
mean, cis people.
yes. Ah, oh, this is the thing that Kathleen Stock points out as well. So her thing is like trans people are living a fiction, and so she points out how like a lot of TERFs take trans rhetoric really literally, and I've seen them. It's bizarre. A friend showed me this group that was like, it's one of these groups that's designed to reframe things that ordinary trans people do as predatory. Like a common TERF talking point is like gender
Yeah.
euphoria is a euphemism for a boner, and I was like, no, it's not. You just said that. That's not how it's used. Um, but it doesn't matter, right? If that's not actually how it's used in the trans community, they're not gonna fucking know. They'll just like, oh yeah, I know the code word now that it's a euphemism for boner.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so like in this group, they posted a TikTok of this trans woman like screaming that HRT hasn't given her massive mummy milkers, and the commenters thought that it was like a lactation fetish.
Oh, what? Oh, wow.
I know. I was like, do I tell them? Do I tell these boomers?
Oh, dear.
It's so much.
Yeah, that preoccupation with sexualizing trans people, and it used to be gay people,
Mm,
is just very strange. Just only viewing it as sexual.
yeah, and like
Yeah.
there's a similar. So like I saw this video by Ty Turner, who's this like trans male YouTuber, and he did a review of like Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, which is basically like the transsexual empire, but about trans men. It's arguing that like there's a trans cult that's convincing young girls that they're trans men and it's causing irreversible damage, blah blah blah
Yeah.
blah blah, standard stuff. And he pointed out that she's got this weird fixation on trans men's lips and describing them as like red and big and
Uh,
soft. I know. I'm like, what? What? Why?
yeah. Again, I think that points out more about you than the people that you think you're criticizing. Hey.
Yeah. I think Abigail Schreier is a lesbian, maybe. I don't know. Regardless, it's weird, man. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, it's like all those Stephen King novels, or the men writing women tropes,
Yes.
and
Oh,
what they're
man.
choosing. Her boobs bounced boobily as she
Yes.
ran out the door to greet him.
Okay, right. So, speaking of, like, so in these groups, obviously, like you said earlier, they're echo chambers and things get, like, wild in these sort of Chinese whisper things. And there is this alleged fetish that trans women have that and this makes me look like a weirdo. I fucking hate it, but I desperately want to know if you're listening, right, and you have this fetish, please get in contact with me because I want to have a conversation with you. This is fascinating. Okay, so the alleged like is this cryptid fetishist? It's like a trans woman who like oh it's okay, I'm struggling. It's hard to say it without cracking up, but like she gets ketchup, puts it in the freezer, and forms these ice cubes in it, then shoves them up her ass so the ice melts and the ketchup comes out, and it simulates a period. And and then
Wow,
and
that's a lot.
and they go around. I've seen like Twitter threads claiming this is what trans women do, and I'm like, I desperately want to meet one if you're real, because you are an icon and we stan. Like,
Wow.
it's so good.
I mean, I was about to say these people need to get a hobby, but I mean, that is their hobby, isn't it? That's like what they've invested all their time into. Just writing bizarre fanfic about lactation fetishes.
But like, but this, because like when I saw like the ketchup period asked like fetish thing, I like would go around and trans people like, yo, has anyone heard of anyone who's actually into it? Because this sounds so fascinating. I want to get into the psychology behind this. And like, I'm then the weirdo, like, yo, guys, who else like sticks ketchup up their asshole to simulate a period? You know, I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah. Why didn't anybody tell me about this?
Yes, I found my calling.
Uh, uh,
Oh Christ.
wow.
Yeah.
Boomers on Facebook.
Yes, basically all the Facebook by this point. Gosh.
Yes.
Righty. Dude, oh no, this has been an absolutely amazing stream. I have loved, and I'm so. I also want to say I'm really sorry I like rambled on so long and for so much.
No, I don't think you did at all.
Oh, I definitely did. I definitely did, Joseph, but like I really appreciate it. I'm gonna put. Hang on, let me put a link once more time. Guys, subscribe to OnlyDog. Do you have what's coming up on your channel? You've had some stuff about Australian politics recently.
Well, I literally just yesterday started school holidays. I don't know how the terms work for your schooling system in the UK, but we've got 6 weeks holiday now over Christmas.
Ooh.
Um, so this is our summer vacation holiday time. So I've got 6 weeks, and I'm hoping to put out a video about Mark Latham, who's that One Nation guy, his parental rights bill.
Mm.
Actually going into that and looking at the feedback from the New South Wales Bar Association and those groups that say what a terrible idea it is. The big Catholic organisations are like, yeah, sick. We definitely want this.
Mm.
And then I just have I've got a bunch more things in the pipeline. I just keep getting ideas and then think, oh, that'll make a great video, and then realize that I don't have all the time that I want.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Like I totally feel that. Like what I do is because like the stuff I've been like coloring in on the screen is like are like the tidbits I normally do, and they're like really easy for me. I just like load up the thing and I translate essentially a poem, and that can take like 5 minutes. I record that and I'm done. So what I
Yeah.
do is I take a weekend off at the start of term. I record like 50 of them and I set them to release like two every week, and then like during the holidays
Oh,
I can start
wow.
streaming again. Yeah,
Yeah. That's such a great idea. Actually,
yeah.
maybe I should do something like that.
I think it's been good for channel
Yeah, because
growth.
I get a lot of anxiety about not, even though it's just a little side hobby that I have. Yeah, I have so much anxiety about not producing content. It's a
Mm.
real trap. I really don't like it, but I mean, here I am.
Big Joel has a good video on how YouTube basically like primes you to feel that way, and like it's making you a
Mm,
content pig, I
yeah,
guess.
I do want to do because I am a film and TV teacher as well. I do want to do something about YouTube as a medium and the kind of constraints and stuff that it has. But again, time.
Absolutely, I know. I'm the same way. Like, I want to do like I've got a couple of video essay ideas I want to do. Like, one of them is, and one of them like this one I could do quickly is like the Latin conscience in Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame, because basically, like the lyrics of the song have like Latin that's in the background, and the Latin sort of
Mm.
tells you that what the character's true feelings are. So like during Frollo's Hellfire
Oh,
song, yeah, the Latin is saying, I've sinned so much in my like sexual desire, basically, and I'm so sorry to God, and he's saying, Lord have mercy. While he's like sort of denying his in English his that he's done any wrong, he's like, I'm a righteous man, I've done nothing wrong. Maria, why is this? Why am I unjustly afflicted by heterosexuality? The Latin is admitting to his sins. He's like, I've been like sort of I've sinned in being too horny, etc. Like, please forgive me. And I know it's so good. And it's the same throughout the whole movie. There's like this Latin conscience that's at the heart of Hunchback that, again, non-Latinists don't pick up on.
No,
It's great.
I mean that's so interesting that like going to that effort to put that in where and also where it appears contradictory. Um, yeah, that's such an interesting topic.
It's not even necessarily contradictory. It's almost like the Latin tells you what the character's like subconscious and true emotional things are. Like in the first song as well, when at the moment when the when the bishop like accuses him, says, "Stop! Don't kill Quasimodo." At the moment when Frollo like you see his face like darken, he starts to realize that he's in trouble. At that moment, the Latin starts singing "Kyrie eleison," which is "Lord have mercy," because that's when he's like starts repenting in his soul and he's like begging for mercy. You know, it's so
Yeah,
good.
right.
Even though he doesn't
Oh,
act repentant, he doesn't say to the priest in English, "Lord have mercy." He says, "Just take care of the child and raise it." But the Latin tells you what's in his soul.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
That I that would be excellent.
Yeah, I need to do that video essay. I should do. But that takes time to like edit a fucking thing, you know?
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Ain't nobody got time for that. That's an old meme. Right, guys, everyone, go subscribe to Only Dog on the Left if you haven't already. I've left the link in the description. It will be in the description to all these videos. Thank you so much, Only Dog. This has been amazing.
No, thank you.
You seem like a
Yeah,
great.
I've had a great time. Hopefully we can do
Mhm.
this again.
I would love to. I would too, because I've gotten a lot of good perspectives on teaching from you. I love what you said about a guided debate as a teaching tool.
Mm, yeah, because it's not. I mean, it's not lying, and you're not forcing your opinion on the kids. But you know more context, and you know more about the statistics, etc., etc. And it's
Uh,
helping them to find it themselves.
yeah. I had a high school sociology teacher who did that because I came into her class as basically a neo-Nazi because my parents raised me with Victorian social, I know, with Victorian social values. And then she was just like, "Why do you believe that? Where's the evidence for that?" And I was like, "Oh, shit." And I know this is dumb, but like
Oh,
it was a religious household. I genuinely never thought I had to give evidence for why I believed a thing. I was like, "Oh, you can just say it. Like,
mm,
that's just how it is. It's how it should be." Um,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
good.
I mean that goes into the whole epistemological stuff, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be a topic for a future
Oh,
stream. Like, yeah, getting
yeah.
out how it relates to a personal self and everything. That would be awesome. Um, yes, I think I'll start wrapping up.
Wonderful.
Mainly complete candidacies because I desperately need to pee. This has been amazing. It's been amazing. Thank you
Yeah,
so
me as
much,
well.
and I'll see you later. Bye.
Yes, you